Hi, good morning, everyone. I know it's 11 and we'll just get started in about a minute as more of our audience members pile in. Thanks for joining us. Hey, that's about a minute, so I think we will get started. I want to welcome all of you to day 2 of the 2025 Northeast RISC Symposium. My name is Emilie Inoue. I'm a Program Development Coordinator at the Invasive Species Center based out of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and I'm also a member of the Northeast RISC Leadership Team. The network was introduced at the beginning of this symposium yesterday, so I will keep things brief today. But in case you are joining us for the first time today, I do want to familiarize you with our mission. Our work focuses on 4 key areas, which are synthesizing relevant science, sharing the needs and knowledge of managers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. This is all, of course, facilitated by a largely volunteer Northeast RISC leadership team. I do want to shout them out, thank them for their efforts today. However, it's our work and also your participation that make the broader RISC network possible. I have just a few quick housekeeping items. Shouldn't be new to you if you were joining us yesterday, but if you are new, you'll notice we are using the Zoom meeting format. This is so that everyone can participate in the conversation. We will have Q&A periods where you are welcome to raise your hand and unmute and ask your question verbally. However, we do ask that you please stay muted when you are not speaking, just to minimize any interruptions throughout the symposium today. We are going to be recording and posting these presentations and summarizing the discussions. So just a note that if your video is on, you may be recorded and end up in those recordings. And closed captioning is enabled. So on the bottom of your Zoom screen, where you have kind of all your different control functions, there's a show captions button. So you can click that if closed captioning is something that you want. And finally, please feel free to use the chat to exchange information and just, discuss and ask questions during the presentations today. The chat was pretty popping yesterday, so it was really good to see that. Hope it's just as active today. And during Q&A, we will moderate between questions both in the chat and any raised hands, again, if you did want to come on and speak verbally. That's it from me. And so I'm happy to turn things over to my teammate, Hallie Harriman, for our first session of today.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Emilie, and getting us kicked off. Hi, all. My name is Hallie Harriman. I am the program coordinator for the Invasive Species Collaborative at Virginia Tech. I also have the privilege of being on the Northeast RISC leadership team and will be your moderator for the contributed talks this morning. So as a reminder, speakers for this portion will have about 15 minutes to present with 5 minutes for Q&A. So please remember to place any questions or comments directly into the chat. And we are going to go ahead and jump right into our introductions for this morning. We did have a slight speaker alteration. Unfortunately, Dr. Evan Rim is no longer able to present at the symposium, but we do have a great substitute. Many thanks to Dr. Deah Lieurance for stepping in at the last minute and with such a great presentation topic. So Deah is an assistant professor of invasive species biology and management at Penn State, and her presentation is entitled Climate Smart Adaptive Biosecurity to Manage Introduction Pathways into Protected Areas. So the screen is all yours, Deah.
Okay. All right, are you seeing the correct screen?
So we can see your notes screen as well.
Why does that happen? After 5 years of COVID, you'd think. How about now?
That's perfect.
Okay,
We can
great.
hear you too.
All right, great. Thank you for the introduction and happy to step in. I'm going to talk about a project that we put together as a part of a workshop in Stellenbosch, South Africa, that it was focusing on invasive species in protected areas. And so the idea that I had was to think about the way climate change would affect introduction pathways into protected areas. This paper has just come out in Biological Invasions. It is open access. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Susie Canavan, Caitlin Faulkner, Katie O'Shaughnessy, Julie Lockwood, Elliot Parsons, Julian Avery, and Wes Daniel. And so this is all nested within the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So this came out of, there was an IPBES report, Global Assessment of Biodiversity. And this Kunming-Montreal effort was a direct answer to how can we increase biodiversity. So these are a series of 23 targets that are divided into reducing threats into biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. And then finally, this is more of the blue part is more about information sharing, implementation of these methods and mainstreaming. I'm going to focus on 3 targets, target 3, 6, and 8. And so target 3 is it was written to designate 30% of the world's area as protected status. And so right now we're sitting at about 16.3% for terrestrial systems and 8.3% for marine. This is a 35% increase since January of 2016, but you can see to get to 30%, we have a ways to go. So the IUCN has divided protected areas into different categories that range from strict nature preserves up to sustainable use of resources. And just indicating here, you can think about, sort of the size, how they're used, and what level of management, and how that might influence your introduction pathways. So a strict nature preserve with very limited use, you would think there would be more of an accidental introduction as opposed to sustainable use of resources where there might be intentional introductions for things like agroforestry. And so moving to target 6 to think about these pathways, target 6 is a call to identify and manage introduction pathways into protected areas to limit the spread of these species. And so we acknowledge that we have limited resources for invasive species management and PAs, and those might differ depending on what country you're in, but generally it's money and it's effort, people. And so managing pathways could be a more efficient approach than doing species by species, so you can catch many species at one time. And we know that there are patterns in introduction pathways, and understanding those patterns can assist those prevention and management efforts. For example, different pathways could be important to different types of ecosystems. And here you see hull fouling on the things attaching to the outside of this boat. It also affects ships. And this obviously would be more important for marine systems or interconnected like the St. Lawrence Seaway. We also know that there's common pathways among taxonomic groups. I think it's universally agreed the #1 pathway for invasive plants is horticulture. And this is a picture of an invasive population of lupines in New Zealand. So understanding those can help us kind of get a clue where to look for stuff and how those things are moving around. And then finally, target 8 is the target that is to minimize the impacts of climate change. And so here they call for the identification of ecosystems vulnerable to climate change and make a call for nature-based solutions. So this could be things like carbon sequestration or doing restoration to build climate resilience. But what we caution in the paper is that we don't make more problems than we solve. And for example, of a problem that's really becoming evident more recently in Florida, this is Pongum oil tree in production. They're growing it for different reasons, but one of those being biofuel. But this is an escape population that's, they have water dispersed seeds, and this is about 2 miles, establishing along a river in Florida. And we found another population that is actually very close to one of these farms. So we do believe that escape is happening from these productions. So just a caution there. So introduction pathways defined are ways in which non-native species are transported from one location to the other. And we identified 4 ways that we think climate change is going to affect those. One is human responses and movement. And so with climate change, we're seeing more catastrophic events, droughts, floods, sea level rise. And this figure here is showing, about 2.3 of the world's population will likely have to move because of climate change by 2050, with most of those folks being in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And those people are moving with their stuff, and a lot of times they're moving close to protected areas. So species, domesticated species, crops, things like that. The next would be human-mediated transport. This is a figure showing global shipping routes in the Arctic, the blue being the traditional routes, the red, what they're anticipating with climate change. So more frequent trips along this route and a whole new, let's cut right straight through the North Pole. And so you're putting either more chances for introductions, or you're putting these ships in areas that they might not have been before. And I apologize, we'll do this one next. I accidentally cut a slide I wasn't supposed to cut, but we have these extreme climatic events that we should all be familiar with. So, we had something like 8 hurricanes, major hurricanes in Florida recently, over the last 10 years or so. And with those, you have flooding events, you have wind knocking down trees in the forest, opening up disturbance. So you're either moving species around with the actual event or opening up disturbance so that invasives can become, can establish there. And then finally, as changes in environmental suitability, and this one kind of interacts with all the other ones. So we know things are moving with warming temperatures, either moving northward or I should say poleward, up in elevation or lower in your oceans. And so we wanted to identify pathways that facilitate introductions into protected areas, look at the current state of introduction pathway management, and provide recommendations for climate smart management. And we put together this, this table. Basically, it's divided into the type of pathway: intentionally released for use in captivity and cultivation, accidentally introduced with commodities, accidentally introduced or during transport along corridors, and then self-propelled. And we just provide some examples there, but we'll drill down on a few here that are also written up in the paper. For release in nature, we have human responses and movement. This example here, we're looking at an escaped population of bamboo in Africa, where they're promoting this species. This is a running bamboo. They're promoting it for, lifestyle improvement, habitat improvement. And a lot of these bamboos have been planted adjacent to protected areas, and they're starting to escape and move into those protected areas. We also have transport stowaways, looking at human-mediated transport. This image here is just illustrating something that's happening called doomsday tourism or last chance tourism, where you're having an increasing volume of people, maybe taking cruises to go glimpse a glacier before it goes away. And things are getting introduced in this pathway. It's just, more chances, more people, and more trips. Escape from confinement. This is an African jewelfish. In Florida, they're seeing tropical, releases of tropical fish moving northward through interconnected waterways from flooding through hurricanes. And so this particular fish is moving as well as a few other, aquarium species. And finally, corridors. This is a picture of the Suez Canal with changes in environmental suitability. It's well known that you're seeing species move through the Suez Canal from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, but with these changes in the temperature of the Mediterranean Sea, we're seeing more species come through and establish and expanded populations within the Mediterranean. And so the current state of pathway management, basically, we have institutional and interagency obstacles that do impede our coordinated responses. It's always limited staffing and funding, and differing interests between rights holders. This figure here, the chart is basically showing just over 60 countries don't have any funding to do management. And thinking about differing interests between rights holders. Some people view, feral hogs or pigs differently than others. So a hunter might view it more different than someone who's more interested in protecting the ecosystem. Or there might be cultural reasons why you would want to keep some of those pigs around. So this is the framework that we developed. Basically, you start here. This is an adaptive approach, an iterative approach. So you start with your toolbox, looking at integrated prioritization, ecological and biogeographic modeling, human dimensions, artificial intelligence, and surveillance. And so those working together can pull together information that we can then feed into the planning portion, where we prioritize pathways, prioritize species, prioritize your areas, protected areas in this case, and look at your resource capacity. That then goes down into your analysis, where you're going to do a full risk analysis on some of these situations and include risk mitigation. And so that could be a pathway analysis or a species analysis. Then that goes into your scenario planning. And from here, we go into our management interventions. And these are just examples, not exhaustive, but say, for example, in prevention, you want to go to a high-risk site and implement pathway surveillance so that you can get in there and act quickly in an EDRR response. Maybe you'll do a pathway treatment, cleaning your boots or your equipment. In eradication, this EDRR response might be to target species or those pathways when we first detect them from some of that surveillance activity. And then finally, containment here, we include an example of thinking about integrating invasive species into our response to extreme weather, and thinking about the damage that we saw in the Carolinas and Tennessee. Those responses, you've got equipment moving all over the place. I would be surprised if a species didn't get moved in a situation like that. And from there, you want to evaluate and adjust your response, basically determine what worked, what didn't work. Think about the efficacy of your response measures. Look for new pathways or new spread dynamics, et cetera. And then respond. Do you modify your response, adjust your action, seek out and integrate new resources? All of that then goes back in here to feed this circle. And by doing it this way, it keeps us on top of things when it comes to some of the uncertainties around climate change. And so just to go through the tools real quick, this integrated prioritization, like horizon scanning or site prioritization, can assist with priority setting, EDRR, and it can help managers stay proactive. Ecological and biogeographical modeling allows land managers to focus on prevention, monitoring, and control efforts. Human dimensions, I think this is really interesting. I've been working with Susan Canavan on some of this stuff, thinking about eye ecology or culturomics, to harvest big chunks of data off of the internet that have been gathered for a different reason. And you can use those digital records to guide your adaptive response. So you can get the idea of like how popular is something in a given area based on Instagram pictures, for example. Artificial intelligence can enhance decision-making. And then finally, surveillance is cost-effective and time-saving. And is a good alternative to large-scale monitoring. And so from here, we give some recommendations to utilize old and new tools to analyze, assess, and prioritize management, employ an iterative approach, develop boundary-spanning relationships like we have here with the risk networks, engage in coordinated information sharing, and refine policy and increase funding to aid in prevention. And how do we meet that target in a changing climate? A paper came out in 2024, I invite you to read, in Science from Langhammer, that shows that interventions, management interventions, targeting invasive species and also restoration have yielded positive outcomes for biodiversity. It's working. Adaptive management, we know, is also a powerful approach to address that uncertainty, and flexibility in management response can maximize positive outcomes when our resources are limited. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the participants of the workshop that was organized by Tammy Robinson and Dave Richardson from the CIB and Stellenbosch. And again, here's the QR code if you'd like to pull that paper. And I think I have some time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Deah. I actually had one question that was sent to me directly, so I'll read it off to you if that works. Scale challenges associated with invasive species, how can pathway management be more effectively integrated into design and implementation of restoration projects? So in other words, what best practices should our land managers and contractors do or implement into their program?
I guess, you know, in thinking about, I guess for me, if I were to make the recommendation to those restoration folks, it would be to really think about how they're moving things around, decontamination of their equipment, things like that, cleaning out the treads of any, you know, boots or you know, ATVs or whatever. And also really think about what they're using for restoration, what species they're using for restoration. I know there's something that I'm seeing more in the literature called rewilding. And some of that is done with native species, but I've seen recommendations for non-native species, and they're calling that a nature-based solution, for example. So I would be very careful about what species you are using and think about what you could be moving around in your activities.
Great. Thank you. And I think one more question, and this one is for me. So I was really interested in the framework that you showed on one of your slides. Will that at some point be available in a more interactive manner so folks like me can use that? Or is it more at this point just something on paper that I can integrate into my program myself?
Yeah, so, you know, this was theoretical. It's kind of a weird paper to write. It was actually harder to write than just a straight up experiment. But yeah, it's sort of a theoretical framework that I believe folks could take that, and then, you know, you could be like, okay, here's how I want to implement these tools. That, you know, you can pull different tools from the toolbox. Think about different ways that you could conduct risk analysis or horizon scanning, different things like that. So I think it's adaptable, but you know, at this point, we don't really have any intentions of like making it an you know, more interactive. But we can have that discussion offline.
Yeah, no, I saw that and I was like, that would be really cool to have as a more interactive tool. But yeah, thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
So I'm checking our chat and I don't see any other questions or comments at the moment. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. But thank you again so much for stepping in last minute. It was an excellent presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, so we are going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Emma Vanderheide. She is a graduate student at Penn State University, and Emma will be speaking to wasted effort. Increasing input does not improve management outcomes for 2 invasive thistles. So Emma, the Zoom is all yours.
Great. Does everything look as intended?
Yep, everything looks perfect on our end.
Okay, fantastic. So hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a third-year PhD student at Penn State in the lab of Professor Kat Shea, who is pictured here. And I'm going to be talking about wasting effort and how increasing management input does not always improve outcomes. So to begin with, as I'm sure I don't need to tell this crowd, we know invasive species have really massive negative impacts on biodiversity and local ecosystems, including really big financial impacts. So to the tune of $423 billion globally in 2019. Much of that impact is borne by reductions to food supply, negative impact on quality of life, and then of course also negative consequences to biodiversity, with invasive species implicated in about 60% of recorded extinctions. And so that takes us immediately to this conclusion that invasive species require management. But then the problem that we immediately run into is that resources for management are limited. And so land managers are in situations where they have to decide how best to allocate limited equipment, labor, money, and time. So most of my research focuses on figuring out how we can allocate limited resources to achieve the best possible management outcome. And so I'm going to start this talk by talking through a framework to think about whether management has been successful or not, and if we've used our effort successfully or not. So I'll present a kind of hypothetical example looking at what I'm going to call 3 possible management outcomes. So if we have a population of an invasive species and our objective is to control or reduce the population size, then we would end up in a situation that looks like this. We have some population size initially, and then after management, we have reduced that population size and our management has been successful. There's a little bit of nuance here because, you know, if your objective is to eradicate a population, then just reducing the population size is maybe not, you maybe haven't met your management goal, but we're at least moving in the right direction. However, there are 2 other possible scenarios. The first is wasted effort. So it's possible that we take a management action and then by mechanisms like secondary invasion or competitive release, we see that we're not actually reducing our population size, or we end up with a new invader popping up in the place of the one we've removed. And this is bad because we've used up some of our limited resources and we haven't actually achieved our management goal. But it gets worse. We could also take an action with the best of intentions to control a species that we're interested in, invasive or not, and actually make our problem worse. And the really classic example of this would be cane toads in Australia, which were introduced as a biocontrol and then just absolutely did fantastic in Australia. And now large portions of Australia are, you know, full of cane toads, which are having really negative effects on biodiversity. I'll also point out that I've presented these 3 options as kind of discrete categories, but really this all exists on a spectrum, and what you might consider successful or wasted effort is going to depend a little bit on your management outcome. But generally speaking, I'm trying to, my work is trying to move us towards the successful category and out of wasted effort and made it worse. But of course, that's really complicated because it's not just a case of applying management and hoping for the best. We have to consider a lot of other things. And of course, number 1 on that list is probably climate change. So as the climate changes, management strategies that have worked in the past or are working now might work less well or not at all into the future. We also have to account for things like shifting phenology might make interactions between biocontrols and invasive species less successful. So the climate has an impact in that way. Second, we have to think when we combine management interventions, are they combining the way that we think that they're combining, or are they interacting with each other in a negative way? So for example, if you introduce a biocontrol agent, 2 biocontrol agents, and one of them is a great biocontrol agent, but a worse competitor, the better competitor is going to outcompete the better biocontrol, and you're going to end up having done more and achieved less. So within integrated weed management, we have this framework or this idea of many little hammers. So instead of one fantastic control option getting us exactly where we want to go in terms of our management objectives, we might use several less successful hammers or options to achieve acceptable control. But it is really important in that situation that every additional thing we do buy us some additional control. And then finally, this is complicated because of capacity to rebound from damage. And I think this is a problem that a lot of invasive species managers face. And the thistles that I'm going to talk about in this talk are certainly have really impressive capacity to rebound from damage. So in working on answering this question about allocating management resources, my work draws a lot on frameworks for understanding disturbance. There is a really rich disturbance ecology literature, and some of the things that people consider in that literature are impacts of climate change and how those might interact with disturbance, what happens when we put multiple disturbances together. And so these are things that, that are also themes in invasive species management. And so I think there's a lot of crosstalk that could be happening there. And that works, of course, because management is at its core a form of disturbance. And if we define disturbance as an event that causes loss of or damage to biomass, well, that's usually exactly the goal of an invasive species management program. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to bring you through a case study using an experiment that I did with combined management interventions and disturbance frameworks for the 2 invasive thistle species that I study. And these are the thistles. So on the left, we have Carduus acanthoides, which is commonly known as plumeless thistle, and on the right, Carduus nutans, commonly known as musk thistle. Both of these are native to Eurasia and were introduced into the United States in the 1800s. And since their introduction, they've spread quite a bit and are now found pretty much continent-wide. They're also invasive and introduced in other areas of the world, including Australia and New Zealand. And throughout their invaded range, they are predominantly weeds of roadsides, disturbed areas, and pasture systems. And pasture systems in particular are where they're a problem because they are covered in these vicious little prickles. And so if you imagine if you're a livestock manager and you're putting your livestock out to graze, they're not going to eat these because of the prickles, but they are going to browse down the competition, and their hooves are going to tear up the ground and create these disturbed microsites where the next generation can establish. And so you can end up with a bit of a runaway infestation of these in pasture systems. And so one estimate puts a moderate infestation of C. nutans, which is 1 thistle per 1.5 square meters, at a 23% reduction in pasture productivity. And so because of that, they have ended up on noxious weed lists in several states. So I was interested in looking at how multiple management interventions impact outcomes in these species. And that's a bit of a vague question. So more specifically, how does mowing affect plant response to flower head removal? And I'll get into why I chose those treatments in a couple of slides. And then secondarily, how this response is affected by climate warming. So I conducted this experiment at the Russell E. Larson Agricultural Research Center, which is Penn State's research farm right in the middle of Pennsylvania. And I'll talk you through my experimental setup briefly with a timeline at the top so you can kind of see the order in which we did things. So in the fall of 2022, I planted my thistles, and then they need to vernalize in order to bolt. So they overwintered. And then in spring of 2023, when they began to bolt, I began applying treatments. I mentioned a mowing treatment and a flower head removal treatment in a crossed design. So of course, our first treatment treated unmanipulated control. And then we also had a mowing treatment. We chose mowing as the first treatment of interest here because it is a pretty common and relatively successful management strategy for these thistles. It tends to be a pretty significant removal of biomass. Mowed plants tend to be shorter and produce fewer flower heads. So it does have an impact, but they can also, absolutely survive this sort of management-oriented disturbance. In order to carry that out, we censused plants weekly, and then on the week at which they first reached 40 centimeters in height, we cut them down to 10 centimeters in height. So a pretty noteworthy removal of biomass. Our third plant we treated with a flower head removal treatment, and we chose this not because it's a viable large-scale management strategy in the same way that mowing is. I mean, you can imagine if you have a yard full of thistles, you can drive a lawnmower through it and you'll really have done something. Whereas flower head removal is a lot more labor-intensive and kind of nitpicky. However, we do have a couple of anecdotal accounts of land managers that are actually, doing this. I spoke to a dairy farmer last summer who pulls the head off of the local Carduus acanthoides on his way to let the cows out in the morning. And on the surface, that seems like it's maybe a good idea. It's maybe helping a little bit because this is a plant that bolts once and then dies. So you would think that, stopping seed set by removing reproductive tissue that the plant has already invested in would do something to control your infestation. It's also reducing seed set is the thing that's going to control your population year on year. So it seems like it's a good idea for something to try, but we also don't really know if it's working. So it's a great idea also, or a great way to test these ideas about wasted effort and successful management and making matters worse, because it's a thing that people are doing with good intentions and we don't know what the actual outcome is. So once again, during weekly census, on the week at which a plant first had one fully anthese or fully open flower head, we went through and cut off all of the flowers and buds, developing buds on that plant. And then we did a mowing followed by flower head removal treatment just to see if there was any sort of interaction happening there, and collected data on life history traits like height and the number of flower heads until senescence in the fall of 2023. And then we did this whole thing at 2 temperatures. So we had a warmed version and an ambient version, just to see if there was any additional interaction with climate warming for these species. Climate warming was achieved via open top chamber. You might hear me call these OTCs. These are these fiberglass cones that surround a plot of thistles, and they break the wind, stop air movement, and so raise the temperature in the plot by about 0.5 degree to 1 degree Celsius. They're pretty common in like tundra experiments. All right, so I'm going to start talking about results. The first thing I'm going to talk about is plant height. This we care about because both species have wind dispersed seeds, and the higher the height they can drop their seeds from, the farther the seeds can disperse. So this has implications for dispersal. As I present results, I'm going to first talk about a hypothesis, so what we expected to see and why, and then I'll get into what we actually saw and how that relates to our hypothesis. So for height, we expected that final height would primarily be determined by mowing treatment. And that's because prior research in the system has shown that mowed plants tend to be shorter. We didn't expect that flower head removal would have much of an impact on height, just because that's not really that much of a vertical removal of tissue. And that is what we saw. So mowed plants were shorter. Here we have the results for Carduus acanthoides with the ambient plants on the left in blue and the warmed plants in pink on the right. As I present these charts, I've got some letters on there which represent all pairwise comparisons, and then the p-values are individual treatments to the control, just so you can get an idea of what sort of like magnitude of significance we're talking about. But generally here what we see is that mowed plants do tend to be shorter and significantly shorter in both ambient and warmed conditions here. The same is true for C. nutans, although the effect size is a little bit smaller and the statistical significance is a little bit more, I guess, muddier, for lack of a better term. But we do see that mowed plants tend to be shorter and flower head removal is not really having an impact in either species. And this effect is pretty consistent between warmed and ambient conditions. Next, I'm going to talk about results in terms of reproductive output. I think this is the most important thing to measure, just because this is the thing that relates to population size from year to year. And of course, fitness is also measured in terms of the number of offspring you produce. As I talk about hypotheses here, I'm going to bring back this 3 possible management outcomes framework and talk about what that might look like in this case of combined management interventions. So our first hypothesis, if we were in the successful management scenario with this experimental design, we would expect to see that all the treatments we applied provided some reduction in the number of flower heads that were produced. So again, because of prior work, we know that mowing tends to reduce the number of flower heads that were produced. And if flower head removal were doing something, we would see fewer flower heads produced in those treatments as well. So something that looks like this graph on the left. However, we might also be in a wasted effort scenario where flower head removal does not reduce reproductive output. So here we would expect to see an effect driven only by mowing. And then the scariest scenario would be this made it worse scenario, in which this thing that people are sometimes doing, pulling off flower heads with the intention of reducing seed set, might actually be stimulating some additional flower head production, perhaps through a mechanism like overcompensation. And this would obviously be the worst case scenario. So just so that you can see these all together, we have this best case idea of successful management. Everything we do gets us some additional control, a neutral case, or maybe even a negative case, depending on your framing, where we waste some effort, and then a worst case where we make the problem worse. And so as the title of my talk probably gave away, our results were consistent with the wasted effort scenario. So flower head removal did not influence reproductive output. So here again, we have the results for C. acanthoides. Under ambient conditions, mowing significantly reduced flower head production, no additional significant reduction with flower head removal. And then under warmed conditions, we see a trend in the same direction, but it's actually not statistically significant, which implies to me that in future climates, even mowing might be working less well for this species. And then as we move into C. nutans and we think about the number of flower heads that were produced, we see an even more extreme version of the wasted effort scenario, in that none of the things we did provided any significant reduction in flower head production. And in fact, we see a thankfully not significant trend towards a slight increase in flower head production with the flower head removal treatments. Although I will draw your attention to the scale of the vertical axis, it's not that much of a difference. And it's of course not statistically significant. So to sum up here, I have a couple of take-home points. The first is that it's possible to do a lot of management work and not see any results. So I spent a lot of time in the field. I removed close to 1,100 flower heads in this experiment. And all I got for my troubles was fingers full of thistle prickles. Second, the best management methods, so things that work now in future climates, those things might also work, or they might work less well. So there's certainly an influence of climate change, I think, being seen here. Also, the slightly different results by species to me highlight the importance of correct species ID and species-specific management. And then finally, while different species may respond differently to the same management interventions, the framework for understanding management actions through the lens of disturbance is broadly applicable. And so I would say that there's a lot in common between the fields of disturbance ecology and invasive species management, and some crosstalk there would be really helpful. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the Shea Lab for all their help on this experiment and this talk, with a special shout out to Emmy McDonald and Alyssa Hibbs, who helped me collect this data. And then I will open it up to questions and leave you with this Australian cartoon about Carduus nutans and its truly incredible capacity to rebound from damage.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Emma. That was great. Wonderful presentation. We did have a couple of questions come through in the chat, and I'm going to kick our first question off from Thomas. And his question is, does pasturing disturbance increase the thistle infestation regardless of the species?
Do you mean for both of these species?
I think so. I think just generally.
Yeah, I mean, right. They are both problems in pasture systems, and you know the way in which they produce a lot of seeds, and so the sort of mechanism of livestock grazing things that aren't these, there's some evidence like goats will sometimes eat them, but for the most part, like your cows and your sheep aren't. And then they have hooves which are tearing up the ground, and so it's really creating nice habitat for the next generation to establish. So yeah, it is primarily pasture systems where there are problems, and grazing exacerbates the problem.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got a question from Bethany. Have you done any comparisons yet between the ambient versus warmed plots? And can you speak to implications of climate warming for growth and flowering?
Yeah, so not so much with this data, but my lab has done a lot of work on the impact of climate warming on these plants. And so yes, under warmed conditions with the same experimental setup that I used with these OTCs, they grow faster, they grow taller, and they flower more. And so there's this sort of, not to throw the word superweed around lightly, but climate warming definitely makes them a bit more aggressive.
Another question from Deborah. It is, what would you recommend for reducing thistle based on that presentation?
Yeah, well, so mowing I think would still be your best bet. If you only have a few, pull them out by the roots. Really try not to let them set seed. There are some herbicide options as well. So depending on what your philosophy is with respect to management and what sort of like land you're working on, that might be an option for you. There are several biocontrol agents also introduced in Eastern North America. They help, but not really enough to like make a difference. So on the small scale, just pull them out. One thing I will also note is that if they have flowered, they are capable of, if they have flowered but not set seed, and you pull them out or mow them and leave them on the ground, the plant will still set seed. So you actually have to like remove them from the environment in order to prevent that.
And I think we have time for one more question. We have a longer one from Jeff. A lot of times timing matters. He has found that removing wild parsnip seed heads when the planting starts dying and before their seeds are fully developed has been helpful in reducing infestation populations over time. So the question related to thistle, do you think this might change your results if seed head removal of those two invasive thistle species is conducted later in the year? So a timing question.
Yeah, I absolutely do. And actually at the same time as I was doing this experiment, I had a couple of extra plants. And so not really enough to like talk about with like a lot of power for inference, but I did do that. So I did a similar thing where I removed flowers throughout the growing season, in the first half of the summer, in the second half of the summer, and never. And the ones that had second half of the summer removal did seem to produce fewer flower heads. So yeah, I think the timing is having a little bit of an impact here.
Thank you. And before we move on to our next speaker, we have one quick clarification from Thomas from the first question. So he actually meant pasture animal species, not thistle species. So yeah, can you speak a little bit more to pasturing disturbance as it relates to the animals and not necessarily the thistle? I know you mentioned goats.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I interpret this as like, does it matter what kind of species you have in your pasture for how the thistles are doing. And I am definitely not an expert in livestock, so I'm going to answer this kind of vaguely, but I would assume it probably does matter just based on the size of the animal. The number of animals you have in the pasture is also going to make a difference because that will impact the intensity of grazing and how much the ground is being disturbed. And then I think I mentioned already, there is some, most animals are not eating these thistles, but there is some evidence that goats will sometimes eat the immature flower heads. And I think even cattle occasionally, the immature ones, but rarely.
Awesome. Well, I think that has wrapped up our Q&A. If anybody else has any other questions or comments, please throw them into the chat and Emma can respond to them that way. Thank you, Emma. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker to stay on time. Our third speaker this morning is Justin Hubbard. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And Justin is going to be speaking about modeling propagule pressure and survival of aquatic species in trade under current and future conditions. Morning, Justin.
Good morning. Hello, can everyone see and hear me and see my presentation all right?
Yep, we can see and hear.
Oh, okay, fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Justin Hubbard. I'm a recent grad from a PhD program at University of Toronto Scarborough, supervised by Andrew Drake and Nick Mandrak. And yeah, I'm going to be looking at modeling propagule pressure and survival of aquatic species in trade under current and future conditions, which is a chapter of my PhD research. So as we know, climate change has occurred to roughly about 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial period. And this is expected to increase to a greater extent in the future. And with it, the rises in temperature as well as the changes in precipitation regimes are bringing impacts to aquatic systems. And these systems, in turn, are expected to have interactions with freshwater invasive species, influencing things like their pathways of introduction, as well as their ability to survive and establish reproducing populations in non-native regions. And the process in which invasive species become invasive is conceptualized as a series of steps that species must move through. First entering a pathway, then being transported to a new location where they become released into the environment, and then they must survive, reproduce, spread, and bring negative impacts to the region in which they are released. And at each of these steps, there are typically specific management goals related to them. Yet overall, the prevention of the release and arrival of non-native species remains the most cost-effective method overall for mitigating the impacts of invasive species, because often once they become established, they are costly and very difficult to eradicate. And one of the cornerstones for informing management actions and the prioritization of where management action should occur is risk assessment. And this can be done on pathways as a whole or individual species, and commonly try to evaluate the probability of species introduction multiplied by the magnitude of their impacts. And for species specifically, frameworks have been developed that require different levels amount of time and information to carry out these risk assessments. And at the higher levels, the more detailed level risk assessment requiring the most amount of time and resources, typically the lower levels filter species up to the higher levels. And so the focus on my presentation today, which is a chapter of my PhD research, is looking at the aquarium, water garden, and live food trades, which historically have been pathways for freshwater invasive species within North America. And one of the ways in which they become introduced into non-native regions is through the release of unwanted pets from the aquarium or water garden trades. And these industries have been growing in recent decades, and there's expectation that this growth will continue. So an examination of these pathways is warranted to help inform management actions and the prioritization of where those management actions should occur. And so this leads me to the objectives of this chapter, which to develop estimates of the number of live trade purchasers who are releasing organisms, and the distribution of that release, those release estimates. Then to estimate the number of organisms per species released, so species-specific propagule pressure estimates. And then third, to estimate where the climate currently can allow species to survive. And then finally, to develop projections of propagule pressure and survival under future human population and climatic conditions. So I'm not going to go over all of this. Is a modeling project, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds into the details of the modeling. We can get into that in some of the question period, but the estimates of the propagule pressure and the releasers is informed from previous studies who conducted surveys to develop an understanding of the proportion of people who own aquariums or purchase live food, as well as the proportion of those people or households that purchase aquariums or own aquariums and purchase live food, who then actually release their unwanted organisms. Oh, sorry about that. So here, I'm just going to showcase the estimates of the aquarium releasers. Here's the historical estimates and the spatial distribution within Canada. And so you can see that in Southern Ontario, we see the highest estimates, but we also see higher levels across the prairies up into Calgary and Edmonton and a little bit on the coast of British Columbia. So you can kind of zoom in. We can see the pattern here. The highest levels in the Toronto area, the GTA, and then across to Montreal and Ottawa. So this is the region expected to have the highest number of aquarium releasers. Then here I've plotted the change in the estimated number of releasing households of aquarium species. And this is a change from the historical 2016 period to 2070 under a median human population growth scenario using a gridded human population projection data set. And so we see a similar pattern as to where existing human population are concentrated. And we see the greatest increases, again, in Southern Ontario, specifically within the Greater Toronto area and Toronto itself. And hopefully you can make this out on your screens. There are some areas of blue, and so some more rural areas are predicted to actually decrease a little bit in the estimated number of aquarium owning households who release their unwanted pets. And so this is likely an outcome of the gridded data set that I used, having built in an urbanization assumption into their data projections for human populations. So here is the plot of the species-specific estimates of propagule pressure. So on the y-axis, we have the estimated propagule pressure on a logarithmic scale. And then on the x-axis, we have the 50 species with the highest estimated estimates of propagule pressure. So we can see that it's largely dominated by two species, goldfish and fathead minnow, or in the aquarium and water garden trades called rosy red minnow, which is like an orange variation of the native species. And what I've also plotted is the bars for the different human population scenarios. So for years 2050 and 2070, and then with increasing what's called shared socioeconomic pathways. So the higher the SSP, the higher the estimated human population growth in the future. And so under future conditions of human populations, we see a roughly 40% increase in the estimated propagule pressure by 2050 under a medium growth scenario, pretty much across the board for all species, and then a near doubling by 2070 under a high human population growth scenario. And then here is for the live food trades. Again, somewhat concentrated into, this is essentially the same plot, 50 top species. So on the y-axis propagule pressure, we see Nile tilapia having the highest estimated propagule pressure. And then we do have a number of more marine type species at the top of the pack until we get down to Mozambique tilapia, and then finally largemouth bass and white catfish, kind of being so Nile tilapia, Mozambique tilapia, largemouth bass, and white catfish being the top freshwater fishes with the highest estimates of propagule pressure. And again, the same pattern of 40% increases under the 2050 medium growth scenario and doubling under the 2070 high population growth scenario is consistent here as well. So now we looked at propagule pressure. So here I show the estimates for species survival. So I use the 185 species with the highest estimates of propagule pressure, and I modeled their climate match using the climate match algorithm, which calculates the climatic similarity between the species existing range, so their combined native and non-native range, and compare the climates of that range to Canada, the climates of Canada here. And I use a climate match threshold of a value of 6, which is taken from the literature, but also I have some support of that in an unpublished study of mine as well, an earlier chapter of my PhD work. And so what we see here on the left is a plot of the number of species with that climate match score of 6 or above, indicating that species is likely able to survive. And so we see more southern regions of Canada, as we might expect, warmer locations have higher estimated number of species able to survive. Coastal British Columbia has the highest, and southern Ontario also higher as well. And then on the right, I have the change in the number of species able to survive under a higher emissions scenario. And what we see here is that the change, the increases in the number of species able to survive, or these estimates occur largely in southern Ontario and coastal British Columbia. And if we kind of zoom in to the Great Lakes region, we see that like the GTA again, as well as the Great Lakes themselves. So there's a lake effect in the modeling here. So those are where they're likely to see the greatest increases in the number of species able to survive in the future. And then here is, so the right plot is the same as the previous slide. The left one's different. This is a lower emission scenario. on the left. And so here I just kind of wanted to show these two plots to show that the lower emission scenario has a lower estimated number of a change in number of species predicted to be able to survive in the future. This is a 2070 scenario as well. And so the lower emission scenario has fewer number of species able to survive in the future than a higher emission scenario. So climate change mitigation, this is a piece of evidence for climate change mitigation to help combat the risk, at least from a survival perspective, of invasive species in the future. Overall, I provide a study that provides some evidence that the risk of release and survival of non-native aquatic species is unlikely to be reduced in the future. If anything, it's likely to increase, barring management actions. And the risk of release and survival is concentrated in a few species, which is a pretty common finding in the literature that is conducted on historical estimates of propagule pressure from the aquarium trade. So a note on some management. So for goldfish in a recent paper, it's been proposed that public outreach and signage campaigns might be an effective tool to help decrease the release of people's unwanted pets. So that might be one thing that could be used in the future. And this leads into my conclusion stage, which here I provide an analysis that can be used to inform management actions and prioritization of those actions. For example, prevention actions aimed at arrival and release prevention, early detection, and detailed level risk assessment. So regions with high propagule pressure estimates and high survival estimates are candidates for management prioritization, as well as species with high propagule pressure and survival estimates can also be are strong candidates for prioritized screening or detailed level risk assessment. And with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone here for watching this presentation, as well as the event organizers. Really appreciate everyone's time, and I'll take any questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Justin, and congrats on graduating. That's awesome. I'm sure you're very excited about that. We do have a few questions that we'll jump right into. The first one is coming from Matt, and he is asking, could you please explain more what variables went into your models? And the second question was human population size, the main predictor of the number of releases. So it's a two-part question.
Yeah, so human population numbers was the main contributing factor to the estimates. And so the details for that were, it was a Bayesian model approach. There's a 2021 DFO research paper, which I used their methodology, which was informed by a 2008 paper to develop the propagule pressure model, which essentially it's informed by earlier work of surveys of populations in different Canada-wide or within Montreal and elsewhere, based on to estimate the number of households that are owning aquariums. Then you take that value and then you estimate the number of releasers from that cohort who own aquariums, and then from those estimates, combine it with import records of the number of species and their import values into Canada, into a species-specific propagule pressure model that takes into account species size. So larger species are more likely to be released than smaller species, because the idea is that they grow to a point where they can't be housed anymore, and then they're more likely to be released. So that's on the propagule pressure side. On the climate matching side, I used 4 variables as supported by a Brady et al. 2015 paper in, was it diversity and distributions, or I think it was diversity and distributions. But they found that 4 variables, mean annual temperature, mean temperature of the driest quarter, and then 2 low end. So like the coldest temperature of the coldest month, and then the mean temperature across the coldest quarter. Those were the 4 variables that I selected for the climate matching.
So we need to move on to our next speaker, Justin, but we do have several questions in the chat. So if you don't mind responding directly in the chat to those folks, because they are some really interesting questions. Again, thank you for your presentation and your time. And we are going to go ahead and switch to our final speaker for this morning. So Hyunwoo Lee, he is a PhD candidate with the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Virginia Tech. And he is going to be presenting on game theoretical models with discrete decisions for reducing aquatic invasive species in Minnesota. So we're going to flip our screen sharing and kick off with our last presenter for this morning. And Justin, when you have a moment, can you stop sharing your screen? Perfect.
Sorry
Thank
about
you.
Hello, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yep, everything looks perfect on our end.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Today I'll be talking about game theoretical models with discrete decisions for reducing aquatic invasive species in Minnesota. I'm Hyunwoo Lee from Virginia Tech ISC department. I'm mostly working on optimization problem, but I found out that it's fun to use those optimization problem to solve the real world problems. For example, the challenges of reducing aquatic invasive species in Minnesota. And this is a joint work with my advisors and our collaborators. So this is the outline of the talk. I will briefly introduce a game between counties and a framework to enhance social welfare, and then I will show some computational results. So as you might be interested, aquatic invasive species in Minnesota is a major threat in the ecosystem of the Minnesota. For example, there are serious stonework, zebra mussels, and etc. And in fact, these aquatic invasive species are spread through recreational boat movement. So we consider a large network graph where the lakes are considered as a vertex, and their boat movement is an edge of the network graph. And then we consider a risky boat movements in the figure left below. If lake A1 is zebra mussel infested, and if lake B1 is not zebra mussel infested, we define this as a risky boat movement. Then the natural question is how to prevent the new infestations, the new infestation. So the boat movements can be restricted by sending inspectors to Lake A1 or Lake B1. In fact, the Minnesota state is solving this kind of problem, and they are putting many budgets to operate the inspection programs. And then it is naturally modeled as an edge-weighted budgeted maximum coverage problem. It looks hard, but it's fine. So the major issue of this EBMC modeling or EBMC formulation is that the solutions can vary depending on whether this EBMC problem is applied at the state or county level. So here comes our motivation. Our study examines the differing priorities of state and county planners regarding the inspection of risky boat movements. Intuitively, the state level decision maker wants to maximize the total number of risky boat movements inspected across the entire state. But in terms of county level planners, considering that if the county planners is self-interested, then the natural objective function is to maximize the number of risky boat movements inspected that are incoming to a specific county. So in the right figure, you can see Cass County. So if you are a Cass County planner, then you might want to maximize the inspection of the incoming risky boat movement. So this can be modeled as a game between 89 or 87 counties in the Minnesota state. And the goal of this problem is to find a pure Nash equilibrium, which represents a stable state in this game. So this county level optimization model is a slight variant of the previous EBMC problem, but there are some differences. So we define the self-interested utility function only with respect to the risk arcs within county C and incoming risk arcs. And then the counties minus C defines the other counties except county C. So this county level optimization problem captures the inter-county dynamics. I will briefly explain what the inter-county dynamics of this problem. If there are risky boat movements from lakes in other counties and those lakes are inspected by other counties, it actually elevates the burden on County C to cover the risky boat movements solely at its own expense. So by doing some inter-county dynamics, each county is actually benefited from the other counties. But still, the county planners is self-interested, so we can consider a game between counties. So the natural question is how to find the pure Nash equilibrium. So suppose that each county player C solves the optimization problem where X bar minus C is the set of decisions of other county planners. So each county planner's decision affects each other. A collection of solutions from counties is said to be a PNE if for each county the current solution is the best response considering the decisions of other counties. So the best response dynamics are iterative procedures where each player solves each optimization problem until a PNE is reached. So in the left figure, you can see each county decision maker solves each optimization model iteratively. We have here like about 86 people. So if we play a game, it's 86 players game. The Nobel Prize winner John Nash showed that the best response dynamics should converge if the game has a PNE. So we use those best response dynamic to find the PNE. But we actually did more. Finding a PNE is a hard task, but identifying the best PNE is much harder task. The best PNE here is the socially optimum PNE. So if there are multiple pure Nash equilibriums, then we can pick the best PNE that is good for social welfare. So our focus is on leveraging this PNE to enhance the state level objective, the social welfare. So we consider the BPNE constraints like this. So upon satisfying these constraints, the refined state level optimization model is resolved. Before I go on to, I will just summarize some some terminologies that I heavily use in this talk. So utility values align with county level objective. The number of, this is exactly the same as the number of inspected incoming risky votes for a specific county. Social welfare, this is the total number of inspected risky votes across the entire state. And budget means the maximum number of inspected lakes allocated to each county. P&E is a stable state in the game, and when I refer to coalition, it means budget sharing or cost sharing between counties in the same coalitions. So what we are doing is actually addressing both state and county level objective. So we can start from the cell level optimization model without any game theoretical setting. Then we can partition the graph with a specific interest of each county. And then we can capture inter-county dynamics. Then we can formulate a game. And using a dedicated algorithms, we can find the P&E and we can find the best P&E. This is done in like algorithmic game theory field or optimization field. But what we are more interested in is to utilize this P&E. So we want to utilize the P&E as a reference point so that while addressing the county level objective, but in the meantime, increasing the state level objective. So the way we utilize the P&E is actually using the constraint as a optimization model. So we propose two variants of refined cell level models, and the utility values at the best P&E are preserved due to constraints 60 and 11F. The reason that we show two variants of this model is because depending on the administrative level consensus between counties, one can be preferred the other. So the RSW model, this assumes no coalitions, but this still preserves the utility. This still preserves the budgets and the utilities of counties from game. And the RCM model, it allows tailored coalitions. Here, the coalition means cost sharing or budget sharing. So if specific counties make coalitions and they make agreements to share the budget, then in terms of the social welfare, it can be greatly increase. So I want to give you a short comparison of these refined cell level models. And RSW is preferred when county planners aim to manage their own budgets independently, and RCM is preferred when county planners are willing to engage in cost sharing. So it's dependent on the county planners and state planners and how they negotiate and how they make coalitions. But we want to highlight RCM model because of its flexibility in incorporating various scenarios. So because it is flexible in making coalitions, we can put more realistic scenarios like here, scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we in our working paper we show some variants of scenarios. First is that by using a default setting, we can impose the minimum budget level, and we can think about the scenarios when a subset of counties are not willing to make coalitions, when the number and the size of the coalitions are controlled, when the coalitions follow predetermined associations. And these can be done by explicitly adding the constraints to the optimization problem. So I want to give you some computational results. So we are comparing the BPNE, RSW, and RCM model. So BPNE means the best PNE, RSW, and RCN we have seen before. So all the refined models, RSW, RCM, in Table 3 demonstrate improvements in social welfare. So it's proven to be effective, and not just in terms of social welfare, but in terms of the county level utility. In Table 4, out of 83 counties, 68 to 69 counties experienced a strict increase in their self-interested utility. In the meantime, 14 to 15 counties could preserve their utility values, and this is achieved by the BPNE constraints. And in Table 5, the RCM models introduce a new budget allocation. When the number of budgets exceeds the number of infested lakes, the counties will lose some of their budget. So this kind of new budget allocation shows that the current budget allocation is inefficient, and that a better solution can be achieved with the new budget allocation. And this is a inclusion of the tailored constraints and tailored scenarios. And the right figure map shows that the same color for coalition and gray for non-coalitions. I want to just remark one thing in Table 10. So in the default RCM model, the budget for a county CASC was reduced from 21 to 11. So it was like 10 unit loss. But in the RCM 1 to 3 model, it now only lose 2 units while increasing social welfare greatly. So this is a key manager insights based on research. As the focus shifts from individual interests to social welfare, the optimal inspection strategy prioritizes infested lakes over uninfested one. Value of information sharing, knowing about other counties' inspection practices is highly valuable. Third, value of leveraging the best PNE, using the utility value derived from the best PNE provides the criteria that each county will want to preserve. And then our refined state level model effectively preserves utility values for all counties, and then make increase for social welfare. And then we highlight the value of forming coalitions and pooling budgets. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, it's kind of like, it may be a little bit math heavy, but we want to show that how optimization, how game theoretical modeling can be applied to the real world practices, especially to address the aquatic invasive challenges. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. I do have 1 or 2 quick questions that came across my screen while you were presenting. One question being, able to share your theoretical findings directly with local county governments? And if so, are you aware of any policy changes that encourage those coalition inspections?
Very, very good question. So we are actually actively communicating with those local county planners, and what we heard from them is that how we estimate the budget, because we are putting the budget to the optimization problem, and we also talked about the scenarios. So I talked about the cost sharing and budget sharing scenarios, and they informed us that what is their current practice, how they are doing cost sharing or something, and then yes, they gave valuable feedbacks, and then we want to incorporate them as a in a modeling side.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I will note Dr. Ezra Toy has also been providing some information in the chat. She has been working with Hyunwoo on this project, and so she's provided a couple of great links, I think, that directly connect this research to that last question I asked about policy and interface. So with that all being said, again, thank you, Hyunwoo. Really appreciated your presentation. I know I learned a lot. We are getting close to our cutoff time at 12:25. So let's see. Before we sign off, though, I would like to express thanks to all of the speakers this morning for sharing their expertise and their insights with us. The presentations were excellent, and we are all so grateful that you were able to share your time with us this morning. So we're going to go ahead and kick off our break, and we will begin again promptly at 1 p.m. with our next session, and that's going to be the communication and terminology panel. So thanks all, and I believe this Zoom will remain live, so you can turn your camera off, turn your audio off, and come back when we resume at 1. Thanks so much.
Assuming we are all, there we go. Okay, sorry, I was just interrupted by the recording message. Welcome back, everyone. You heard from me earlier today. My name is Emilie Inoue. I'm going to be moderating our first afternoon session. I'm very pleased to introduce our communication and terminology panel, where we will hear from 3 experts on the words and messaging we use to talk about invasive species and climate change, both amongst other researchers and practitioners and with the public. So the way this one will run is that each expert will speak for about 15 minutes with around 5 minutes for questions specific to their talk. And then all 3 of them will be brought together for a brief panel discussion at the end. So as usual, you can either post your questions in the chat, raise your hand and come off mute during the Q&A period, or you can save some questions for the panel at the end if we do have a bit of extra time. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Emilie Fusco first to speak.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. Let's see. All right, can everybody hear me okay and see my screen?
Everything looks and sounds good, Emilie.
Great, thank you. All right, then I will jump right in and get started. So my name is Emilie Fusco. I am the Deputy University Director at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And today I am going to be talking about a paper that we had come out recently, so the Emerging Invasive Species and Climate Change Lexicon. Before I jump into, the substance of this paper, I just want to acknowledge all of my co-authors on this project. So this was an effort that we did across the RISC network. So we have folks who were affiliated with all of these institutions that you see at the bottom here. And really, this was very much a project from across the RISCs. So the other authors on this project are Brian Falk, Paul Heimowitz, Deah Lieurance, Elliot Parsons, Kate Rottler, Lindsay Thurman, and Annette Evans. And some of these folks are actually on the call today too. So if there are any, really hard questions where I get stumped at the end here, we'll see if any of those folks want to come off mute and jump in as well. All right, so we can jump into this talk here. All right, so I want to start first with these familiar terms. And so we have native, non-native, established, or non-native and established and invasive. These are all terms that have been, very commonly used in invasion ecology. A lot of these terms have been debated in their own right, but we're not going to focus on that debate today. And instead, hopefully, we can all start together in this place of acknowledging that these are very commonly used words in invasion ecology. But with a changing climate, we're seeing that this new kind of invasive species and climate change lexicon is starting to emerge. And all of these new terms are getting introduced that really are trying to describe what we're seeing in terms of species changes in ranges and changes in their impacts. But with all of these new words coming at us from different places, we're also seeing that there's a lot of ambiguity associated with these terms. And that's resulting in a lot of confusion, especially in situations where we really need precise language to apply policy or management options. And so to address kind of this area of confusion, we thought that really rather than pushing for a standardization of terms, we wanted to offer everyone a framework to help organize our thoughts around what we're seeing going on with invasive species and climate change and all of these range shifts and changes to impacts that we're now experiencing. And so to do that, we can start again with these familiar terms. So our invasive, non-native, and established and native species. And so when you're looking at whatever ecosystem you're managing or studying, the species in that ecosystem are going to have a status that aligns with one of these terms. But with climate change, there are kind of these two main things that can happen. So as climate changes, we expect that all of these species in that ecosystem can either stay where they are, or they can start to shift their range. We also see that there are kind of two options for impacts from these species. So either a species has a known negative impact with an ecosystem or no known negative impact. And again, this is a category that can change with climate change. At the bottom of the screen here too, you'll also see that there are three colors. So there's that blue color. And as we kind of jump into this chart, we'll see that the blue color indicates that there's no change for a species in movement or impact. The yellow color indicates that there's only one change. So either impact or movement is happening, or this orangey color, which indicates that there's a change in both factors. So we're seeing a change in impact and movement for each of these species. And so if you start off with a species in an ecosystem that has a native status, in response to climate change, there's the possibility that that species could stay where it is in your system and continue to not have an impact. And that's where you see that blue box there. So the species is still just native and it would keep its native status. The species could also shift its range to a new ecosystem. And even if it still doesn't have any impacts in that ecosystem, some words have started to emerge that might refer to that species. So you might see it called a climate tracker or a range shifter or a neonative. You also might see that the species stays where it is, but starts to have some kind of impact in an ecosystem. What we found is that there weren't really any words already to describe a native species staying where it is, but having an impact because of climate change. But one word that might be applied here is nuisance native. So that's a term that folks have used in the past to describe native species with known negative impacts. But it really hasn't been used explicitly to convey any change related to climate change. And then in the orange box here, you see kind of this other situation where our native species shifts to a new range and now has an impact in that new range. Some of the terms we're seeing used to describe this are nuisance neonative or a native invader. So you can do this same exercise with species that currently have a non-native and established status. So again, they stay where they are, not having any impacts. They're probably going to keep that same definition or that same terminology of non-native and established. If they shift, the only thing they're doing is kind of moving to a new range, but they were already in a new range. So we're seeing, probably the way that folks would refer to them still is in that non-native established terminology. We also have seen in these situations where a non-native species is kind of starts to have these no negative impacts as a result of climate change. One term here that might be used as sleeper species. And then again, in that kind of two change category there, it shifts to a new range and has negative impacts. Maybe you could use the term invasive here, but again, there's not really a term to describe what's going on in this situation, especially that explicitly conveys climate change. And then for our species that start with a native status, you see it in these boxes 3 and 4 here. There's a bit more that we're missing in terms of terminology, at least by what we were able to find as a team looking at this. And so if you have an invasive species that either stays or moves, but it no longer has a negative impact, there's not really, as far as we found, a word or terms being used to describe this exact scenario versus, if our invasive continues to have a known negative impact, regardless of whether it stays or shifts, we're probably going to continue to refer to that as an invasive species. And so by providing this kind of framework here, we were able to identify these boxes 1, 2, 3, and 4 that don't really have terms yet. So it's hopefully a proactive way to start thinking about these situations that maybe we're not talking about quite so much yet. And also, regardless of what terms you're already using or what you've heard, everything should kind of fit into here. So ideally, you'd be able to use this as a way to really communicate what scenario you're talking about when you're thinking about species range shifts and changes to impacts. So a lot of what we're talking about so far is, thinking about trying to get everybody on the same page and really thinking about, how we can communicate with each other better. But sometimes, ambiguity isn't going to cause a huge problem depending on what the situation is. And in some situations, getting past that point of ambiguity and gaining a common understanding can be resource intensive or involve, a lot of time and effort among folks. And so we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about when figuring out when getting this common understanding is most important so that we can start to prioritize when we want to do that. So we're going to go through 4 different examples here. Each of these examples have varying amounts of climate change related ambiguity and what's happening in these kind of species movement impact scenarios. And they also have varying levels of disagreement in whatever management decision we might undertake. So that's the consequence here on the vertical axis. And so we can use these different levels of ambiguity and consequences to determine when we think it's most worthwhile or most advantageous to address that kind of climate change ambiguity to help mitigate our consequence in management. So in our first example here, we have the southern pine beetle. And so for those of you that are not familiar with our southern pine beetle story in the East, this might be a familiar story to a lot of you. This insect moved outside of its native range and more north into New York State as a result of climate change. And in New York, the species' native status was highly ambiguous in New York as a result. Because that was because the species moved that way on its own. And for a lot of reasons, there's a lot of confusion about whether this would be considered a native species. And that became a problem because that resulted in a really high level of disagreement in how that species management should be funded. Because the way that one of the funding pots worked essentially is that the funding required that a species have non-native status within the state in order to access those funds. So eventually what happened here is that it was, experts were convened and it was determined that the species should be considered native in this situation. So they weren't able to access that funding, but this took a lot of time and effort to get to this point. And so using our chart here, this is an example of a situation where you land in this upper right area where addressing ambiguity can resolve that consequence of, what do we do in terms of management? So decision for which funding source to use for management. Another example that we can talk about here is the golden jackal. So this is a European example. It's expanded its range in Europe, largely in response to climate change. And there is legislation in Europe that stipulates specifically that native species that are shifting their ranges in response to climate change are not non-native species. So they're considered native species where they're going. And so there's really not any level of ambiguity there in terms of, the legality of what's going on with the species or how to classify it in that sense. But there is still a huge range in response for how to manage the species in Europe, depending on, this range in response is both across and within countries. And the species status, depending on where you are, can range anywhere from being a protected species to something that is a huntable species. So here there's really low ambiguity in the species native status that's been defined and written out. But there's still really high disagreement in how that species should be managed. So whether it's something that should be hunted or protected. And so in this situation, you know, addressing that ambiguity is not going to resolve the consequence because there really isn't any ambiguity there, but there's still a lot of, you know, discussion happening about how that species should be managed. So the next example here comes from the Pacific Islands. So this is about the cabeus vine. So the native status of this vine is debated across the Pacific Islands, but in Palau, it is considered a native species. But this vine has negative ecological impacts. It is shifting its range, and there's some evidence to suggest that it's becoming even more problematic with climate change. So regardless though of any ambiguity around the species' native status or the causes for the range shifts or these changes to impacts, you know, it's generally agreed that this vine should be managed because it does have such a high ecological impact. So for the cabeus vine, there's really high ambiguity, but low disagreement that it should be managed. So that lands us in the lower right area. And then back in the US, we have this native white-tailed deer. So at high population levels, we all know that deer can have negative ecological impacts. And as winters are becoming milder due to climate change, we're seeing in a lot of areas that deer populations and their impacts are increasing. But in these cases, there's actually really low disagreement about whether we can do things like adjust our harvest limits to reduce populations or negative impacts, as this is like culturally, generally like a, you know, something that people do and has not faced a lot of pushback in terms of this being a potential management strategy. So this puts our deer in the lower left-hand corner. And so using this method, we can see that you know, the deers, there's not really a resolution needed here. We're seeing some things happen. There's low ambiguity that climate change is affecting deer populations, but, you know, we can continue adjusting our management as needed. And so using this method, we can see in the top right corner with the southern pine beetle that really maybe is like the most important place to address ambiguity related to climate change, because it can actually help resolve some kind of consequence or management disagreement by thinking about, you know, yeah, addressing that ambiguity maybe proactively. All right, so just a quick couple of notes to wrap up. We discussed that invasion terminology is this really rapidly evolving to accommodate climate change. But we are seeing this cause confusion in some areas, especially in places where we need really precise language and understanding to follow, you know, legal things, management plans, and that type of applied work. We can use this framework to help us adapt our thinking and accommodate a diversity of new terms. And so rather than really trying to standardize terminology here, we're hoping to just create a common understanding of the scenarios that we expect to see with climate change, or that we're already seeing with climate change, so that we can all, you know, discuss and maybe proactively decide on what we want to do in some areas. And then finally, we talked about how, you know, our decisions to invest resources to resolve some of these ambiguities is something that we can approach strategically, especially given that a lot of these might require intensive resources in order to resolve these ambiguities. We might need to be a bit strategic about in which areas we focus. And I will stop there. And I think we have maybe a couple of minutes for questions.
I think we have just about a minute. I think there is just one question anyhow for now. So Thomas asked, for many species, it's not easy to tell if they've shifted their ranges independently or with human intervention or facilitation, especially if you include indirect ways of that happening. Do you think this ambiguity matters? Did this come up in case studies or in this framework?
Right. So whether a species moved on its own or whether it was assisted. Yeah. So I think it did come up a bit, and there's that human element is a really big piece often of how we talk about invasion. I think one thing that we did talk about a lot was if species are shifting into a new range because of climate change, or that new area is now a suitable habitat because of climate change, that in a lot of ways that is still a human assisted movement, given that we have anthropogenic climate change. As far as whether there are a lot of legislative barriers to like how you might manage the species, that I'm not totally sure of, but that would be another area that folks could maybe proactively address as they're seeing, some of these species that we might expect to move.
Okay, thanks for answering that question. And we'll see you pop on screen again after the other two speakers. Okay, so I forgot to mention, but this session is stacked with Emilie's. It wasn't on purpose, but it seems to have happened. So I'd like to introduce Emilie Inoue, our next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I was having technical issues. Can everybody, just to make sure I'm doing this right, I'm used to Teams, so I just want to make sure that everybody can see in the centered image there. Are we good?
It all looks good and you sound good.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for having me. My name's Emilie Inoue, and I'm the plant health section supervisor at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. And I've been working in this realm for, 19 years now, always at the Agency of Agriculture. And I have been working in the invasion ecology realm for that long. So I really appreciate being asked here, because I just want to name one thing right off the bat. I am a non-white presenting, Asian presenting human being. And I just want to acknowledge and name that my own personal experience and exploration in this realm is, I've experienced it probably differently than many of you. It doesn't mean it's worse or better, but it's different. And so with that, I do come with a different perspective than some folks. And I just ask that people keep that in mind. And I'm also coming at this with a lot of humility. There are a lot of researchers and academics here. I am not that. I am just a public servant working in this realm with the public often, and I have a deep commitment to protecting Vermont's environment, but I also have had some issues with how we message and talk about invasion ecology. And for many years, I thought it was just me. And over time, I've realized that more and more people have been talking about this, which is awesome. So I'm offering one case study of how we're deciding to approach this in Vermont, which is a soft approach. And I think that's hard to talk about in these hard scientific spaces. And I just want to also name that so hard that I didn't know how to make this presentation interesting. And I just kind of embraced, okay, this is a really different approach, so let's go with it. I used AI to come up with the images, and I just put in some, keywords, and this is the stuff they came up with some of those keywords. So I just want to acknowledge that there aren't any attributions to the images because they were AI generated, which actually was pretty cool. So what are we doing here? We have realized in Vermont that we have a shared collective desire within our community of practice to actually have these conversations, because a lot of people are feeling this tension. What is it? And it's really hard to name and articulate. One of the things state government is not known for is you know, really clear communication, collaborations, you know, breaking down silos. And I think that's changing, which has allowed us, at least in Vermont, to explore what a collective approach to exploring this issue looks like. So the purpose of this presentation is to show how we're creating space and prioritizing it for time and open discourse, which we found can create a different kind of depth and richness to the conversation, something that we don't do enough of, I think, and recognizing that to actually implement true transformative, sustainable change, we cannot be mandating anything, and that we need to make this organic, and so collectively exploring it as the people who are actually doing this work. It's going to take time, but it's going to be more about transitioning to being the kind of change that we want, however long it takes. And it's a big scientific process. We don't know what's going to happen. It's an experiment. We do know that there's evidence-based research out there that allows for reflection on our past approaches, for consideration to make adjustments at least, because we know studies show language impacts public perception and policy, combative and xenophobic and emotionally charged messaging. There's research there that shows can hinder ecological efforts. Warlike metaphors can increase a sense of aggression and exclusionary attitudes, and overly alarmist messaging can cause disengagement or resistance. So I think we owe it to ourselves and the general public to be talking about this issue in light of all this information. So what are we doing in Vermont? Just naming some of Vermont's unique contexts. We are a small, very environmentally conscious state with a strong commitment to social responsibility. It creates a friendly container that's conducive for having these conversations, and that's important to name. We have strong professional and personal connections because the state is so small. We literally know each other in the private and public sectors, and we work closely with each other, which allows for more than just professional colleagues and siloing. This actually gets to real connection and relationships and understanding and curiosity about each other's point of views. And in doing that, we have been able to identify a collective ethos and desire within the state community of practice to have these conversations, and we're in a position to have that because specifically the Agency of Agriculture Secretary is extremely supportive of reviewing and reflecting and exploring this with other people, as are the secretaries over at the Agency of Natural Resources and the heads of Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy. So we do have a unique opportunity to bring voices here because of the connections and relationships that all of us have fostered and prioritized over the years. So how did we start the conversation? It all started with the plant health team sitting around the table while we were opening up the noxious weed rule to rewrite it. It needed to be written, rewritten. Last time it was written was 2012, and we identified a lot of issues from a practicality standpoint, the lack of flexibility. I mean, it was just bureaucratic stuff that gives everybody a headache, including us as the regulators and enforcers. So we opened it up with the intent to make it clearer and more accessible and more practical and adaptable. And in doing that, it set off some real internal discussions where one of the things that we identified was that we really didn't like what had historically been named and known as the Vermont Invasive Exotic Plant Advisory Committee. And while we were sitting there, we were working it back in, and then we literally stopped. And I mean, it seems so stupid because it's literally a light bulb goes off in your brain second. We were like, wait a second, we don't need to do things the way they always have been done just because that's how we were taught and learned from. So with that, I guess, sudden recognition that we are there, opening the change that we have access to and the privilege, we also recognize that, oh my gosh, you know, we are literally as government public servants spoon feeding the framing and the way the public, the non-scientists, understand and perceive these issues. As I become more curious about what other people's experiences are, I found that we end up operating in a bubble that is scientific and our own echo chamber where we take for advantage some of this language. So I think it was really important to reflect on, we operate amongst ourselves, what is the actual public perceiving and learning? And there was this gravity of, wow, we really can help the understanding be more deep and nuanced, the way it should be, because that can make an impact. So with that sense of responsibility to incorporate neutral and descriptive language into our rules and policies, we decided to work on a position paper for the Agency of Agriculture Secretary to review and hopefully back, which is exactly what happened eventually. But the collaborative position paper, which is what it actually turned out to be, we started off with the core of it, going through and doing a lot of research, reading material that maybe a lot of people in the hard sciences may not take the time to read because they're based in a lot of the social sciences. But it's important because the theme that we keep coming back to is humans aren't separate from the issue, and yet we talk about it so removed. That was a little bit bothersome. And the more we started researching, the more happy we were because we recognized that there are a lot of people that have been doing this work and looking into it for many years now, long before it was even on our radars. And also just to throw back and naming the original wisdom of the indigenous folks who always and never forgot that we are separate, and everything, the language has an impact in how people are welcome and feel about talking about issues and wanting to engage. So there's a lot there that we felt that we learned from exploring all these resources, and I will put a link up so folks can check out that position paper. More than the position paper, it's there are a lot of resources there that I encourage folks to read, describing the power of language. What started off with an Agency of Agriculture Plant Health position paper, what we ended up doing is we sent it out to all of our collaborators across state government and the private sectors and asked people to look at it, review it, and give us their feedback and input. And by the end of it, it took a couple months. By the time the final draft was ready, it had the fingerprints of over 20 people, all representing different parts of the invasive ecology sphere and space in Vermont. So we were able to get a lot of perspectives and buy-in because people cared and spent time about this. And that was powerful because it kind of planted a seed for the possibility of something more. So how did we do it? We realized that there was a desire, so we made space. I mean, that's literally as simple and as profound as it is, recognizing that no one person, agency, or organization has the answer. This is a collective problem, and all of this is pointless unless we actually are willing to sink in and look at it from all perspectives, from the ecological perspectives and the social justice and the impacts in all these different layers, because everything is interconnected. And we believe we need to start thinking about that and integrating that more into our work, because it just feels true. And the more I talk to people, the more I understand most people feel the same way. And one of the limiting things that we've experienced is the lack of an opportunity to connect and have these larger dialogues, to plug into a sense that this is something bigger than each of us individually. And it's overwhelming, especially when government absolutely needs to be involved in these conversations. And that may be a sticking point for some states, because that is difficult to make the pitch and then hope that it's supported all the way through up the hierarchy that we are operating in. So I told you a little bit about the position paper being a great starting point for us to explore policies, regulations, and outreach efforts and how language shapes the public perception and their engagement. We agreed as a group to learn together. And who is this group? Totally owning, we have no idea who needs to be involved. We just know that everybody needs to be engaged at some level. So we recognize that the group that we're starting off with is not the collective. It is not everybody. So we have left a lot of people out just because we haven't gotten to that point yet. We needed to start somewhere. So we decided to start amongst state government who has access to the rules and policy and the language that a lot of people depend on as the foundation. And so we have the Agency of Agriculture, the Departments of Forest, Parks and Recreation, Department of Environmental Conservation, Fish and Wildlife, and the Agency of Transportation, along with the Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy. Those are kind of the starting group, realizing and recognizing that this group will grow. Each of us is learning, exploring, thinking about it, and then bringing this conversation back out to our own spheres of influence and trying to engage and explore that way. So the last thing we want to have people feel is people are left out of the conversation. That is not the point, but we need to start somewhere. So the Agency of Agriculture decided to be the host of this. It's kind of like, you know, we agreed to be a chauffeur in a bus. Now we are trying to figure out who to get on the bus. And then we have to just, I guess, keep growing the bus because there are more and more people who are interested. So we are using, valuing, and prioritizing appreciative inquiry in our process, which takes time, and it prioritizes all the things that we have learned in our system not to, because it's a waste of time, it's too soft, it's not productive, and that's just not true. And I think we all know that. So making the argument to leadership that this is worth the time and prioritizing you know, energy and resources towards it will end up serving the people of Vermont and those of us working in this space in a way that is kind of priceless. And there is value in that, even though we can't quantify it the same way we can in some of the hard sciences. So the appreciative inquiry, for folks that don't know what that is it shifts discussions from what's wrong with language to what has been effective in fostering understanding and engagement. It encourages open and non-hierarchical dialogue where people explore possibilities rather than feeling defensive about existing terms or approaches. And it supports a gradual and grounded shift in messaging by highlighting successes and collective strengths rather than imposing mandates. So that's the collective approach that we've decided that we want to use. And to do that in a way that feels good, we need to redefine what we view as success. We are often told that we need to set a goal and to produce a product by this time. This cannot work in a transformative, meaningful way on a tight timeline. So we've agreed to keep this space open and let it take as long as it's going to. And because individual egos and ownership and all these territorial issues are a non-issue, there is nothing attached to this time frame because we all just want to slowly see and become and embody whatever is going to happen. And I have no idea what that is. And modeling change rather than enforcing it. As we become and internalize some of the stuff that we're talking about, we are going to be able to teach people by showing and being it. And as an example, the Agency of Agriculture, because we were opening and rewriting the noxious weed rule, we did have to kind of take the liberty of renaming some things because we didn't have time to have this open discussion. So that is one thing that we are modeling, is that we updated some of the language. What we are, we're under no illusion that we're going to lose invasive. We're going to keep using invasive, but introducing this concept of introduced invasive species builds in the separation behind some of the language that we're seeing weaponized right now. And just as an aside, a friend of mine from the TNC was telling me the other day that they were working with a group of elementary schoolers, I think this past fall, on some invasive species clearing work. And when they were talking about the invasive species, what actually came up as a refrain, which was very disturbing, is build the wall, build the wall. And so I just want to name that and offer that this is stuff that is having an impact in real life in kids' lives. Even though we may not see it as an issue, some people do. And it doesn't mean that we need to change it, but it's important that we acknowledge the impacts that we're having, even if our intentions are pure. And I see, Emily, I'm almost done. So just a lot of different woo-woo things, I think maybe some people might call it, but I do think that this is the most exciting thing that I've been a part of in my professional career. I think it's the way forward. That's what I know I personally and professionally crave, is this kind of deep internal reflective work that then shows up as meaningful work that I really care about. So with that, we know we have the information, we have the research that allows us to ask with humility and curiosity whether the ways we've learned to approach and talk about invasive species with some of the public remains the most effective, or if adjustments are needed based on what we now understand. And we are just leaning into that conversation collectively, and we'll see what happens. But I'm proud of Vermont for modeling what I think good change looks like. So I have links and everything that I will put in to share with folks, including the position paper. And Lee Greenwood came and gave an amazing webinar about her work with the spongy moth, which was incredibly inspiring, and highly suggest people go check that out, because it's an amazing story. So with that, I'll close it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Appreciate that perspective. I think someone did actually share the link to that paper in the chat, which is great, but any other links, obviously feel free to.
Sure.
We'll do just one question, and then of course you will join for the panel after Rachel, but Jenica asks, your process sounds very collaborative and open. Did you experience any resistance or hesitation to participate in the conversation? If so, how did you approach those hesitations, and did those parties ultimately participate?
Yes and yes. For the conversations that we're having, we recorded the webinar, but we are modeling what, we set group norms, that what we say stays in the group. We don't record the open discussions and conversations to remain privacy. And yeah, people are uncomfortable, but what's amazing, and I think worth considering, is if you create a space that is safe and you model that and you hold the container with compassion and direction, that is just very conducive and inviting to exploring these things, people will show up because there is a desire to have these conversations. It's just about creating the right environment to bring that out. And that's the dimension that I believe we've been missing in government in a lot of the ways we approach these issues. So take it or leave it.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear you found that to be the case. So yeah, thanks again. We will move on to our final speaker for this session. So with that, I would like to welcome Rachel Reeb.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Just give me one moment to share my screen. All right, can folks see that okay?
Yep, everything looks and sounds good.
Great, thanks. All right, so hi, my name is Rachel Reeb. I am an invasive plant ecologist by training. I am currently a forest science associate at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania's Research Institute, which is based in Western Pennsylvania. But I just recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, which is located in Pittsburgh. And there I sort of had an interesting dual position as both a researcher and as a science communicator. And so I'm here today to talk about our efforts at the museum to build public awareness of the invasive species problem and develop effective communication practices. So one critical role that we as scientists and educators and land practitioners all have to play in addressing the invasive species problem is, of course, by engaging in public communication. This is a really necessary practice for a variety of reasons. For one thing, it helps folks in the public build a collective understanding about the invasive species problem. It helps to connect our community members with high quality information and resources to engage in effective solutions. And perhaps most importantly, it helps folks engage in sustained long-term participation in solutions. Much like the climate change issue, invasive species are a wicked problem. Solutions are really slow moving. It can take years or decades to see progress. And so communication efforts are this really important intermediary action that, for us to take to keep people continuously engaged and bought into this issue. At the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, we had this goal of raising awareness and inspiring engagement solutions amongst the public within Pittsburgh. We wanted to be able to incorporate more effective information about particularly invasive plant species within a new exhibit on invasive species as well as related programming. So in 2023, we were awarded a grant by the Richard King Mellon Foundation, which allowed us to kickstart what we called an invasive species awareness campaign. This was about a 2-year campaign that was led by Mason Eberling, who is the curator of botany there at the museum. And one of the really fantastic things about this project is that it was, led and co-led by a very talented, interdisciplinary team within the museum. So we not only had, folks like myself and Mason, who are sort of staff scientists, who were, had a really deep knowledge of the field of invasion biology and critical issues, but we also had experts in science education and science outreach who were able to lend their expertise on science communication practices. So it's a really great sort of blending of minds for this campaign. And so for the rest of this presentation today, I'm going to talk about, what were the primary communication goals of the campaign, discuss some of the best practices that we adopted to try and implement our communication goals, and highlight some successful outcomes, and particularly sort of talk about our new invasive species exhibit, which is opening in the next week or so. So when this project started, one of the first things that our group really wanted to do was understand how this communication campaign fits into the broader landscape of science communication work that's happening in Pittsburgh. Obviously, invasive species education is a topic that's commonly covered by environmental organizations and educational organizations. And we wanted to make sure that our messaging was aligned with that of other educators in the city. And we also wanted to be able to identify opportunity gaps that we as a museum could, uniquely take advantage of and make sort of new contributions to this conversation. And so throughout the course of the project, we held a total of 4 professional workshops. These were discussion-based workshops that where we invited a bunch of, education and environmental professionals to the museum. We had a really great representation in these meetings. There were over 20 environmental organizations that attended across these different meetings. And these discussion sessions were really helpful in allowing us to sort of narrow in on a set of communication priorities for the campaign. The other huge benefit of these discussion-based workshops was it was a really great space for us to develop partnerships with a lot of these organizations that we've been able to really leverage within our programming and outreach materials. So through these workshops and extensive sort of internal discussions at the museum, some major opportunity gaps really came to the forefront for us, and these turned into our communication goals for the campaign. The first major goal that we had was to improve public understanding of certain critical concepts in invasion biology. These are basic messaging points that we found were not yet common knowledge amongst the public, but which are key to effectively addressing the invasive species problem. The first messaging point that we focused a lot on in our work was this idea that humans are the root cause of the invasive invasive species problem. The public, even though this is something that's deeply understood within the professional community, the public does tend to retain a poor understanding of how invasive species are introduced, what are those pathways of invasion, and who in particular is involved in like sort of facilitating those introductions. In particular, we focused a lot on sort of explaining the role of modern horticulture as like a pathway of species introductions. This is a really critical messaging point to be focusing on, we found, because it helps to challenge our audience members to examine their own individual accountability in this problem, as well as that of their community members. The other critical concept, or one of the other critical concepts that we focused quite a bit on in our materials, was this idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Again, this is a very common concept within the professional community. We understand that preventative strategies are one of the most efficient solutions that we as a community can engage in the long term, because it takes infinitely fewer resources to prevent something new from establishing rather than it is to like eradicate it long after the fact. So we really focused a lot on our materials on communicating that everyone in the community has the ability to participate in these preventative solutions, whether it's exerting their influence as consumers at garden centers, promoting the cultivation of native species, engaging with local policymakers, spreading awareness in their community. There's a variety of things that folks can do to engage in preventative actions. So by building up, a foundational knowledge of these two core concepts, we hope that, our community members will be better prepared to participate in solutions that are both effective, but also persistent. In order for us to, promote these critical concepts within our exhibit and within our programming, we spent a lot of time at the outset of the campaign as a group, sort of engaging in discussions and evaluating existing communication practices that we are utilizing at the museum, and starting to sort of parse through, what are some of the more effective versus less effective strategies for communicating about these critical concepts. Just for the sake of time, I don't have time to talk through all the different changes that we implemented at the museum, but I am going to highlight just one example of a communication practice that we update that made us much more effective at translating some of these core concepts. And that major change was in the way that we utilized metaphors to describe invasive species. We made a major shift away from the use of invasion metaphors, which are any sort of metaphors that compare invasive species to aliens, criminals, enemies, monsters, colonizers. These are very pervasive, metaphors that are utilized in science education materials traditionally. The problem with these metaphors is that they tend to anthropomorphize invasive species and treat them as if they were autonomous actors. And this presents a major communication barrier because that framing implicitly ignores the role of humans. So instead, we made a shift towards utilizing what we call passenger metaphors, which relate invasive species to non-autonomous, amoral actors, and allow us to implicitly attribute causal responsibility to humans. So for one example of a passenger metaphor that we've used in a lot of our practices is to start referring to invasive species as introduced rather than non-native or alien. And the reason is because this is a passenger metaphor that implies the existence, of another actor who's carrying this passenger along. And it sort of opens up a conversation that we can have with our audience members about who that secondary actor is and sort of what are their impacts. All right, and then the other sort of major communication goal that we had in our project was to promote more ethical messaging frames. As folks during this session have already mentioned, it's becoming increasingly apparent that certain communication strategies are drawing public criticism and generating a mistrust of invasion biology. And this is primarily due to communication materials that rely on militaristic and nativist rhetoric to sort of justify the practice of invasive species management. And this is rhetoric that we commonly see in educational materials that relate invasive species management to the defense of territory, utilize words like, eradication, stopping the invasion, population control, protecting native residents. Any of these strategies which compare invasive species to bad actors like enemies, criminals, villains. Again, people within our professional community are increasingly recognizing the harm caused by this form of framing. Not only does it reinforce a distrust of outsiders, which has sort of uncomfortable parallels with the political rhetoric surrounding human immigration, but it also, misrepresents the field of invasion biology as something that is political or ideologically biased, rather than being sort of a neutral form of science. And this is generating a lot of distrust in the basic science. So, we have been finding that this sort of rhetoric has the potential to alienate a lot of our audience members that we're trying to bring into the conversation and interact with, especially from historically marginalized communities, such as like the AAPI community. Luckily, there are a wealth of resources out there which point to improved ways of framing the invasive species problem. Here at the museum, we've spent a lot of time exploring different types of framing that can be ethical and politically neutral, but still highly effective at inspiring and motivating the public to engage in solutions. And so this is actually a really great example I love that came out a few years ago in the Journal of Environmental Management. It was produced, I believe, by the Wisconsin Sea Grant group, but they provide some really good advice about framing invasive species solutions as an act of altruism and land care, and really sort of framing this as an act of humans being responsible for land care, and encouraging folks to sort of take accountability and taking action in the problem. So yeah, so there's lots of great resources out there. It was a really fantastic couple years of trial and error, seeing what works with our audiences, seeing what doesn't, and adapting things that kind of connect with folks in our community in Pittsburgh. All right, and so for the last few minutes, I'm going to talk through some of the ways we've been working to actually implement these communication goals within our program, and particularly the new museum exhibit. I'm very excited about it. It's opening next weekend on March 22nd, but the title of this exhibit is called Uprooted Plants Out of Place. And the sort of big idea is that the past, present, and future of invasive plants in our ecosystems are defined by human actions and notions of stewardship. So this is an exhibition that draws on some of the strengths of our historic herbarium collections at the museum to tell the introduction stories of invasive plants. We're presenting narratives that emphasize ways that invasive plants are intertwined with human stories of colonialism and culture and globalization. And we're also presenting materials that provide a magnified view of some of the interactions invasive plants have with their surrounding human and non-human communities. And also, and in doing so, highlighting the enormous environmental impact of this problem. So one example of a story that we're telling through the museum exhibit is of multiflora rose. This is once a really common species in the horticultural trade. Back in the 19th and 20th century, it was promoted widely by federal conservation services as a form of erosion control. It was sold and promoted and advertised as like a living fence to help folks contain livestock. But today, it's widely recognized as being one of the most annoying sort of nuisance plants in our environment in Pittsburgh. It's a very thorny bush.
Okay, I just
and folks, yes, it's a very thorny bush. Pittsburgh have a slang term for it called jagger bush. And our goal in telling the story of the introduction pathway of this plant is to highlight, the particularly horticultural pathways of introduction, and open up a deeper conversation about how this could have been, prevented through responsible decision making. We're also very excited to highlight the work of a Japanese photographer named Koichi Watanabe, who has been photographing images of an invasive species called Itadori knotweed, or also known as Japanese knotweed, across different parts of its range for the better part of the last 10 years. They've provided us with sort of custom photography of Itadori knotweed within Pittsburgh. And we've been in our exhibit, we'll be able to just juxtapose that with photos of knotweed from its home range in Japan. And Koichi's work is fantastic at highlighting the ways that invasive species act as passengers to human movement and follow human geographic patterns, and invites his viewers to compare the different roles of plant species in their home ranges versus their introduced ranges. And lastly, I'll mention that, that we are doing a lot of, or that we're also very excited, I guess, to share stories of holistic invasive species solutions from community organizations around Pittsburgh. We really want our visitors and audience members at the museum to feel like there are actions that they can take and see themselves engaging in solutions. And so we did as much as we could to sort of highlight local invasive species work in our area. So we are featuring the work of an urban community farm, as well as a goatscaping invasive species management nonprofit, and also one of our parks conservancies in Pittsburgh within a video. We're doing interviews and having them sort of share out their personal stories of invasive species stewardship. And lastly, before I finish up, I just want to plug that a lot of our lessons learned from this campaign are summarized in a peer-reviewed publication in Plants, People, Planet. We provide more detailed recommendations in that paper about best practice for ethical language and effective framing. So if you have questions, feel free to obviously look at that paper, but also feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to have a continued conversation about this, because I am very passionate about this topic. And yeah, and with that, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. Maybe just a couple of really quick exhibition-related questions before we bring in the whole panel. So I have, how long will the exhibit be available, and is there an online component to the museum exhibit?
That is a really good question. So the exhibit is not a definitive takedown date, but the current projection is about 2 years. So we're estimating about 2 years for the exhibit. And the online component, so there will not be a virtual or like a digital version of the exhibit itself, but I believe that there are going to be like associated materials and digital materials provided on a sort of web page about the exhibit. But I don't believe that we're going to have like a virtual walkthrough or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, lots of great compliments and everything in the chat if you want to take a look, but I think that's it for just your component. So I will invite the other two speakers from this session back onto the screen so we can have a bit of a panel, put you guys in conversation with each other. And I see the two Emilies coming back, hoping we can get all of us spotlighted. There we go. Okay. So I'll say this, if people do want to put any other questions in the chat, feel free to, but I'm going to try to kick us off with a few things that I've prepared. I will try to maybe pose this one to all of you, and I think Emilie Inoue, you kind of did touch on it, but feel free to elaborate still if you'd like. I was hoping each of you could address how you'd respond to assertions that focusing on terminology or vocabulary communications distracts from working on the invasive species problem itself. Actually, so okay, maybe we will go to Emilie Fusco since you were first up.
Sure, I'm happy to start us off on that. I think, in some ways, especially when we're talking in, maybe academic contexts or really in these theoretical contexts, talking about terminology, I can see how people would think that that's like a distracting place to be rather than those, rather than like applying and doing the work. But I think that, for folks working in the applied world and in the management context, and when they're, people are actually meant to operationalize these terms, terminology becomes really important because we are tied to how we talk about these things in the ways that we can act on them. And so in that way, it's not a distraction at all. It's really at the core of what determines what we can do on the landscape.
Hey, thank you. Other Emilie, I will turn it over to you. this conversation doesn't get too difficult with the three Emily.
There are a lot of Emily. No, thank you. I actually am really interested in hearing more of the academic scope of things, but I do think that, I think we need to ask ourselves when we have that initial contraction of, oh, there's no way that would work, because we're so stuck and used to having learned that the combative and the certain ways that we've learned how to frame things is the best way. We are scientists. The evidence shows that it's not, even though we may personally have a gut reaction to it. And I think those things are separate, and both of them are so valid. A lot of this is about just being brave enough to own our own feelings and thoughts around this and not be ashamed of them, because we all have our feelings. The fact that I've been harmed with a lot of this language doesn't mean that all of you have been harmed. But I feel it differently, and I want you all to know that. And I'm not ashamed, because I don't feel like I'm soft or fragile or a snowflake because of it. It's literally human neurological biology. We are wired with words. The language is how we connect and understand each other. It is fundamental. And so I would challenge anybody who is having a visceral response to it of number one, what are you scared of doing it differently? What would it require? Too much work? Is it because you don't want to change? Just ask yourselves the motivations for hanging on to a way that we can see now through data isn't necessarily the best way. So I would just throw that down as a challenge. And it's uncomfortable, and I want to name that. But we can all be brave. This isn't scary stuff. This is human connection and being human. So let's just start acting that way, truly. I'm pretty blunt about this stuff, but I feel so strongly about it. So Emily, Rachel.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that both of you are saying. And the thing I'll add on to that too is that, invasive species solutions, in order to work, they have to be relatively universal, right? Like we are asking huge groups of people to engage in solutions. And in order for that to work, we have to be able to appeal to folks that have a huge range of different types of value systems, different types of motivations, different perspectives of nature and land care. And in order to do that, that requires adaptive storytelling and adaptive framing. And that requires, having a deep understanding of the individuals and their value systems. So I would argue that, even though it is obviously a lot of work, and that's why people dedicate their whole careers to learning how to communicate effectively. But the more that we can learn as particularly like myself, I came from a scientific background, and I had a huge learning curve and, picking up on all this different sort of expertise and rhetoric. But it hugely helped me communicate or improve my own practices. And it helped me feel like I could connect with people and really like get through to folks, a lot more effectively. So I would just say that is like, whether we like it or not, we have to be adaptive. And the more we can kind of work on that, the more we can bring in a larger group of folks from all sorts of backgrounds to engage in solutions.
Hey, thanks for that. All three of you have kind of shared different projects, processes, frameworks today. I'm wondering, after having like watched these, are any of you thinking like, oh, maybe I can use that in my work? Like Emilie Fusco, for instance, had kind of the chart with, the different words and how we categorize these things. Maybe are you guys like looking into doing something similar in your work, or just if anyone wanted to jump in and speak to that, if you felt inspired today.
I just want to say thank you. What this has provided me is an opportunity to connect and identify Emily and Rachel, whom up until this point I didn't know, but having heard and learned from them today, we are going to be having ongoing conversations in Vermont, learning from all of you and what you're willing to share with us. This is great. It's further conversations that we will be having, hopefully, if you're willing, because we'd love to learn from you.
Absolutely. And I completely agree, Emily. And I think I felt really connected to something you said at the start of your presentation, which was that you felt sort of alone or felt like nobody was sort of talking about this issue at the outset of your initiative. And I think the folks at our museum felt that way a lot too. It was something that was just not super talked about. But once we started like exploring and like talking with not just other organizations in the city, but other organizations across different parts of the US and different institutions, like people have been thinking about this topic for a long time. A lot of people have done just like really fantastic work that's only really just starting to get out into like the digital space and being shared out widely. But yeah, folks have been working on this issue a lot, and there's a lot that we can learn from each other and a lot that I've learned from other folks.
And can I just add another thing that I think I just want to make sure people don't forget? Just a lot of this, hang on, I just lost my train of thought. I apologize. I felt it was important. Something about the process. It'll come back to me probably. Hang on. Just continue on with your questions.
Sure, yeah. Emilie Fusco, we hadn't heard from you yet.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just echo, yeah, the shared sentiment that it was really nice to learn from the other panelists today. I think, Emily, it was great to see what's going on in Vermont and like these concrete actions that have already been taken, and seeing that there's ways that other groups can learn from that and see that it can be done. And then Rachel, I think, for me, it really resonated, that kind of reframing of invasive species as passengers. I really liked that kind of way to think about things, and I'll be kind of mulling that over as we head out today.
Okay.
I remembered what I was going to say, and it's just that having these conversations, even if we do not change any of our language, what I've been finding is as I connect and talk with people, you can't forget these conversations, which then challenges. There's like this little bell in the back of your head as you're communicating this stuff, where you still may be using the same language, but it forces you to look in the mirror while you're saying it, and challenges like, how else? So I think it's a great way to like ward off dementia and other things, because you're actually working your brain to be creative. How can we navigate this space knowing that there is an emotional, for me, it's an emotional response. I feel it in my body. I don't like using them, even though I do use them all the time. But there is that, there's an impact there, even if nothing is actually changing on the surface. And that's the abstract stuff that is hard to quantify, but I certainly feel it, and I can tell others are feeling it too amongst the group who are talking about this.
Yeah, the self-reflection, I think, is always valuable in itself. So I will allow that to be the last words. I think we have come up to time. I want to thank all three of you so much for this discussion, and really appreciate you joining us today. So thank you, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Matt.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for our last session of talks coming up. We have some exciting presentations planned, which include both some contributed talks as well as updates on current research being done by the Northeast RISC leadership team. And if time allows, each speaker will be able to answer some questions from the chat at the end of each talk, so feel free to ask them as we go along. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Grace Gutierrez, a PhD student at UMass Amherst and also a member of the Northeast RISC leadership team, who will be presenting How Low Should We Go? Reviewing Seed Collection Strategies for Climate Smart Restoration. Grace, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen real quick. So can everyone see it?
Almost. We still see your presenter view.
Oh, okay. Okay. What about now?
It went back to your presenter view. It was
I'm so sorry. Okay. Here we go.
Yep.
Good?
Yep.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Grace Gutierrez, and I am a PhD student here at UMass Amherst. And as Matt nicely said, I will be talking about some work that we're doing here on the RISC team called How Low Should We Go, which is reviewing seed collection strategies for a climate-smart restoration. So there is a common thought, and mostly with ecological restoration, that local genotypes and local plants are the best. And that kind of makes sense because when we think about restoring habitats, we want to, help protect, the environment that it's in, and also try to create the most resilient habitat to keep from invasive species growing back and potentially choking out our native ones. So there's a big idea that like local plants, are, adapted to the local environment, which might make them better competitors against invasive species that are known to rapidly grow. So right here, we can think about like a native milkweed. And so if we were trying to restore a habitat that was found, we'd want to try and gather milkweed from around, the Northeast, or if we were doing it in Massachusetts specifically, other populations in Massachusetts. However, this might not always be the case, and this is because of climate change. So I think it's really important to note that the climate is changing up to 10 times faster than native plants can keep up with. And so we can see here on the left provides a really great example of how the climate could change in the next century. So here we have New York State as we know it. But you can see that by the turn of the century, under a high emissions scenario, the climate could change from where we are in New York right now, or a little even further down since we are in 2025. And the climate could be closer to that of Georgia, which, for reference, is over 1,000 kilometers away from New York State, where it is right now. So that's like definitely worrying. So that's, a great shift in the temperature and the climate of New York. And what's even more worrying is that native plants just can't seem to keep up. So on this figure on the right, we have both dicot and monocot plants and, how fast they are spreading. So this dashed line right here is the spread rate of 3.25 kilometers per year. And that is about the spread rate that plants would need to kind of keep up with the changing climate. And so as you can see here, that the native plants, they aren't doing so well. They barely have a spread rate, or they don't have a spread rate of even 1 kilometer per year, which is particularly bad. And then additionally, we can see that non-native plants, they have no problem with keeping up with this changing climate. So that's definitely something of concern when we're trying to restore native habitat and, kind of plant native plants as well. So a lot of scientists and land managers have, really been thinking and researching ways to help native plants prepare for a warmer climate. So, this is where we enter our hero of the story, climate adjusted seed provenancing. And I guess this slide here is just to kind of point out that there are tons of different types of provenancing. We briefly touched on local provenancing, which is just collecting from, the area around where you are, restoring. But today we will just be focusing on climate adjusted provenancing. So you might be wondering, what is climate adjusted provenancing? So climate adjusted provenancing is essentially, in the most simplest terms, is moving seeds or plants from further south in their range to a more north location. So basically moving plants from warmer climates up to cooler climates. So essentially, using our milkweed example here, if we were doing some milkweed restoration in Massachusetts, we would want to choose plants plants in the same species of milkweed from further south in their range, probably around like Baltimore. and to move them up. And so the idea here is that, because these plants, have been grown in Baltimore, presumably for some time, that they might be more adapted to warmer climates that now, or in the future, Massachusetts might be experiencing. But then as part of our, as part of the risk team, and then our small research group, we were looking about this is, very common in restoration there. It's one of the highly recommended practices, but what is the success of these, provenancing? What's the success of these transplantations? And so we started doing a bit of a deeper dive into it. So first we looked at most of the work has been done on trees. So moving trees from warmer and colder climates. And what's great to know is that there were actually little fitness differences when transferring trees from distances that are less than 500 kilometers. So, if we moved a tree up into Massachusetts, if it was under 500 kilometers, that's great. However, there were some fitness costs when, they were moved from areas further south, so over 500 kilometers. So in this example, that's around Georgia. So if you move a tree from Georgia to Massachusetts, it would probably not do as well due to the colder climate. And so this was great news. And I also, there's a great resource by Pike et al. Who looked at the USFS seed transfer guidelines. So if anyone is curious, I would highly recommend that they check this out to learn more about transfer distances for East Coast trees. So yay. Then we were thinking, well, what about non-woody plants? That's oftentimes a large focus of many restoration work. And unfortunately, we found that less work has been done on kind of these non-woody, sometimes flowering species, but also grasses as well. And to very mixed results. So sorry, if I just go back real quick, a lot of the work specifically in North America was done on some plants that people might be familiar with if you're local to the Northeast. So you have your nodding onion, your partridge pea, and your black-eyed Susan. And then from the West Coast, we have purple needlegrass. But a lot of the work showed very mixed results when doing these transplant experiments. So here on the left, we have the nodding onion, and as you can see, as overall fitness on the y-axis, and then the northern, local, and southern population. So these are where they were taken from, and then they were all brought into a common garden in the the local area. So for the onion, we can see that the northern genotype did the best. So, it'd be kind of the opposite of what we expected, where plants brought down from more cold areas into warmer areas, presumably, actually did better. But then for the partridge pea, you have your southern genotype that did better. And then for your black-eyed Susan, you have actually the local genotype did better. And so these were all from one paper by Woodridge et al. And then when we look at the purple, the grass, we can see that, there weren't a lot of significant differences between the non-local and local populations. So, this is all to say that a lot of work needs to be done. And that is why we need you all. And I guess this is also to say that I don't want to scare anyone being like, oh, climate adjusted seed provenancing doesn't work. Be scared. But just to highlight that there needs to be a lot more research done on a wide variety of plants. And so, I would encourage if anyone has any interest in doing projects like this, if you're sitting on any data, to share it and publish it, because I think it's very helpful for all these restoration issues. And yeah, and also I'd like to say keep a lookout for some research summaries coming out from the RISC network, and an R2P2 paper focused on the state of science, that a more in-depth view of what I just talked about. And thank you all so much for listening. I'd like to, acknowledge my amazing co-authors, Dr. Bethany Bradley, Dr. Eve Bury, Matt Brinka, and the RISC network as a whole. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was great. We're out of time for questions. I know there was at least one question in the chat maybe you could address on the side. So we're gonna move on, and next up we have Shriya Natarajan, a student from Wilton High School in Connecticut, who will be presenting EradicateIt, join us in the fight against invasive species. Shriya, whenever you're ready to share, you can go right ahead.
Awesome. Let me go ahead and do that. Is everything, can everyone see everything? Oh,
yes, looks great.
Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Shriya, and I'm so excited to introduce EradicateIt, a mobile and web app which utilizes artificial intelligence to combat invasive species. Through this project, I've combined my passion for AI with my interest in environmental conservation to create a tool that makes invasive species identification and eradication much more efficient. So just a little bit of context for this, since I am a junior in high school, which is a little bit different than everyone else here. This project started around my sophomore year when I noticed something unusual during cross-country practice. A little bit of context about me as well is I'm an extremely unobservant person. And I knew that by the end of the season, when I had noticed everything had become overridden with like the exact same kind of plant, something was up. Later, I discovered that it was Milominate, one of Connecticut's most invasive plants, but it definitely got me curious, and I wanted to reach out to the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group to learn a little bit more about this issue. A few questions that I had was, why was spread increasing so rapidly? Why does no one talk about this? And what could I do to help? Obviously, I'm not going to lecture you guys about how invasive species are bad. I think that we all understand like how that is, but I was very shocked to find out how big of an impact this issue like has on ecosystems and the environment, yet like so few people talk about it or even consider it like a valid issue or something worth discussion. Which definitely led me to try to find a smarter technology-driven solution just to help maximize current eradication efforts and make sure that everyone's time is being spent well. But this is kind of the main overarching question, which is driving my research. How could I use artificial intelligence to create a mobile app which can maximize eradication efforts? Currently, many existing plant identification apps are inaccurate or don't provide useful data for conservation efforts. I realized that artificial intelligence could do more than just identify a plant. It could identify the plant with high accuracy using AI-powered image recognition. It could geolocate infested areas to create a real-time heat map of infestations, and it could also use clustering algorithms to prioritize removal efforts where they are needed most. By combining these capabilities, we're moving past just education, where now we're moving into directing conservation efforts in the most effective way possible. One of the most important features of this app is clustering. But what does that mean? So here's a little small sidetrack, but in data science, clustering is a method which is used to group together similar data points. In the case of my app, this would be very useful in terms of identifying hotspots of invasive growth. So as you can see here, this is just an example image, but let's just say that these were all observations. Seeing these color coordinated things helps show conservationists and people who aren't familiar with this issue exactly where they could get involved, which just helps simplify it and make it as easy to get involved as possible. Now moving into just kind of basic features of this, let's kind of just use Autumn Olive as an example here. This is the upload page where you're going to take, where the latitude and longitude is going to be automatically filled out, and along with my name and like the observed on date. And I'm going to upload an image, and then I can include like an optional description. And using the machine learning model GPT-4o for identification, it will identify these plants as one of the top 10 invasive species in Connecticut with about an 88% accuracy. Now, let's just say that as a new user, I was unsure about what exactly the plant was, or I wasn't sure that AI was comfortable with detecting it. No worries, I have included an About the Plants page, which includes simple descriptions. So I know that the image that I uploaded had berries on it, but to someone who doesn't know much about invasive species, they can read this description and be able to feel confident in their identification, which is kind of subconsciously helping them to get more involved with this issue again as well. Next, we have the faceted map. And this is something that is really, really useful for conservationists and people, just because you can filter by plant name, city, zip code, and clusters. Obviously, there is a key is included here. But if I remove the filters, you would see like a big map with all the observations for every single plant. But I think just again, having a visual is so useful and important because it shows exactly where you should be directing your efforts. And it really helps to quantify this issue, which I feel like hasn't really been done yet and has been useful. And that's kind of where clustering can come into play, where even though you're technically removing some data points from the set, you're still showing the clear groupings and areas which you need to focus your efforts on more, which is definitely a lot more useful than just having some scattered data points. So that is one example of the way the chart provides that. Sorry, okay, here you go. And then very similarly, you have the faceted table search. This is definitely going to be utilized for more back-end things, but the initial thought process behind this was if you wanted to take a look at a certain town or a certain zip code or a certain like cluster, or just filtering for a specific date, you could do that here with this table. And that could help conservationists analyze trends in invasive spread based on like the time and like the season, which you are noticing more and more observations occurring. So this might not be as useful for someone just getting involved, but still it definitely is very, very helpful for those who have a lot of experience with invasive species research. Sorry. Okay, now we are moving into some of the more technical features, and this is called the plant dashboard. So using kind of sticking with autumn olive as our example plant, I can filter for that, and given the year 2024, say I was just curious what that would look like, it'll show you a pie chart of all the observations filled out by town. And you can see that in Mansfield, Hamden, and Norwich, for example, invasive spread is a little bit more prominent. And it also includes a bar graph showing the trends all the way from 2011 all the way, it shows the increase in invasive species as well. This is specifically for autumn olive too, which is very, very cool. And here you can see again another application of that clustering, where instead of just showing random points in the town, it is being grouped together based on those priority areas and those priority spots. Similarly, you have the town dashboard, which is very similar idea, except this time you're filtering for a specific town, and it'll show you the breakdown in that town as well. And then here you can see the bar graph, which will show the observations by year in Wilton specifically. Okay, now let's go and get a little bit more into who can use this. I know that I kind of skipped over this briefly, but a large part of my research and everything was making sure that this app was usable by every single person, regardless of not even knowing what a plant is to someone who spends their entire life working on this. And that is because ultimately with this field, the biggest issue is a lack of volunteers. And when you have a lack of volunteers, people are kind of in their core, if they're already not really interested in the topic and they don't know how to get involved, simplifying the issue to just making it as easy as taking a photo, I think is a really nice incentive and a really easy way to get people more involved and more learning about exactly how that is. And I'm sure, like, as you can see with the visuals, they are very like stark and like they are very like they show people exactly what is going on. Whereas if you just show like a snippet of like a given spot in nature, it might not be as impactful in getting people involved. So that was definitely a big driving factor of this. But while I have been definitely talking about all the positives of this app, I'm sure that you notice that there are definitely some limitations. First, the number one thing I want to address is how some of those trends which you saw in those images might have been less accurate. Obviously, invasive species spread is increasing, yet on the app, it definitely shows that after 2023, 2024 drops a lot. This isn't a fault of the app by any means. Rather, it's about like that lack of observations. Because if you don't have the observations, and since this was cut off, like I want to say I imported the data in around November, I wasn't able to get like the full year's worth of 2024 data. And also the platform which I was using to do this was iNaturalist. And when I did that, I needed to filter for verifiable and research grade images to train the identification model on, so that way it would be able to accurately assess and identify images, but that definitely led to a lot of observations being cut out. And the other main thing is funding. This is something that I'm actively working on, but as I'm sure you all know, not all conservation groups receive funding. A lot of people do this on their own time, which definitely was an incentive to make me want to pursue this and work a little bit harder with making this. The machine learning model, which I was using, GPT-4o, is created by OpenAI. And if you were to use it regularly, the annual cost of using it would be around $6,500. And this is a lot of money, especially considering a lot of conservation groups. I know the one here, I was speaking to the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group. They don't receive any funding. They're a nonprofit organization, which is really sad to me because a lot of people do this on their own time, just because, just out of having a genuine care for helping this issue and everything. So funding is definitely a little bit of a sad thing, but in general, the features of the app are viable and they work regardless of the data set and everything. So even with the smaller data set, we can definitely see how trends are being displayed and everything. So it's still producing some accurate information. However, it shouldn't be taken word for word. With that being said, I do have some future plans. The number one thing that I really want to do is create a Q&A forum. You have all these new people who are now getting involved with the issue, who have been taking photos, and they have questions. Commonly answered questions, I think if I could create like a sort of forum where admins would be able to answer them and where admins would be able to answer and then guide them to other resources, that could be really, really useful for showing people that you're committed to the topic and like how easy it is to get involved. And so along with that, I could create some kind of filter where based on your location, it would show you nearby events like towards your town or your area or your state, etc. Next is ground truthing. I know I mentioned that we need to have more volunteers and more observations in order to produce more accurate analytics. But something that I was researching is called ground truthing, where you basically go to these priority areas that the clusters have identified, like hotspots, and you create and you rank it on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being it matches up perfectly with what the analytics show, and 1 being it doesn't match up at all. And using this data analysis, I can probably create weights to adjust the factors, so that way the pie chart wheel, it won't show NA anymore because it would be filled up and it would add to 100%. And the other thing to work on with funding is partnering with organizations for profit. I did reach out to OpenAI early on in this process to ask them to waive the fee, since this is technically a community service project. It's not necessarily for my own benefit. Unsurprisingly, I did not receive an email back, which is okay, because I do plan on reaching out to more organizations, but that is kind of where I am at right now with in terms of funding. And then I know right now I only have, I'm only working on the top 10 invasive species in Connecticut, but I plan to expand to 30 and to go all the way across the Northeast, just so that way I can create a more comprehensive guide for this project. And With that being said, any questions, feedback, and concerns would be very much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Shriya. There are a bunch of comments in the chat that maybe you can address after, but we have to move on to the next presentation now. So thank you so much. That was really great.
Thank you, guys.
So next we have Mar Wiltz, an undergraduate researcher from the University of Vermont, who will be presenting From Drizzle to Deluge, Unraveling Climate Change's Role in Post-Japanese Knotweed Restoration.
Awesome.
Mar, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me get here. Awesome. Can you see it?
Yes, looks great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Matt, for moderating. And yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. So just to get started, I wanted to provide a brief intro to like Japanese knotweed, and because it goes by a lot of different names and can look a little bit different depending on where it is. Japanese knotweed is native to East Asia, specifically Japan, China, and Korea. It was imported to the US as an ornamental species in like the mid to late 19th century, and now it is found in over 43 states across the US. And as of 1999, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature began to list it as one of the top 100 worst invasive species. And here in my home state of Vermont, as of 2011, it has colonized our 3 major rivers with thousands of individuals, which continues to cause pretty significant ecological impacts across the state. Getting more into that, some of the reasons why it's able to do that is that it's able to quickly establish and then forms dense monocultures that outcompete our native species and then decrease our biodiversity along the riparian ecosystems in which it exists. And this is also it has an increased shading capacity. And so the plant leaves bare ground underneath its dense stands, which then significantly increases the erosion risk and then subsequent risk of pollution in the area. This all somewhat comes down to its phytotoxic allelopathy, which means that it's able to inhibit the growth of other species around it. And some potentially say that allelopathy also promotes its own growth. And so what are we doing? What are we doing about that? So we have a couple of different options for managing for knotweed. That includes mechanical removal, either like brush cutting or trying to pull it. It is rhizomatous, which makes that a little bit more difficult. And then we have chemical treatments, which herbicide, love it or hate it. I'm not a huge fan of it around riparian ecosystems. I think that's that can cause some increased issues as well in terms of ecosystem health. And also, when it comes down to it, even if we do remove it, even if we do kill it, it still has secreted this allelopathy into the soil, which will then continue to inhibit the growth of other species even after its removal, even after the plant's removal, sorry. And so with that, removal isn't the end of the road, you know. We have to continue to consider what the allelochemicals, what impact they will have, including the fact that I believe a study in 1995 by Tang et al. Found that the quantity of allelochemicals actually increases under stressful conditions. And with precipitation being increasingly variable under climate change, plant stress is increasing. And so we kind of find that all of these factors interact and are pretty related and are going to continue to play off of each other going forward. Which brings us to the question of how will climate change affect the allelopathy of Japanese knotweed? To test this idea, we set up an experiment with field soil and locally harvested cuttings, moderating the precipitation. So we took the average precipitation for the state of Vermont during the growing season, and that was our average treatment. And then we had 50% less and 150% of that for our dry and wet conditions, respectively. We also then went out and collected field soil using some of our, working with some of our community partners to identify good sites for that. We found allelopathic and then our control soil, trying to make them as similar for soil type and texture as possible. We did use the native genotype of black willow because these cuttings are oftentimes used in restoration efforts here in Vermont in riparian areas. That is the Salix nigra. And then we used a non-native willow to try to see what that might look like. And this was the white willow crossed with the crack willow. Over the course of 16 weeks, we had 120 individuals growing in the greenhouse and under these treatments. And just a couple weeks ago, we were able to move forward with harvesting this. So what this meant is for our data collection, we collected our above and below ground biomasses. We collected weed biomass for each of the pots. And then we collected our covariables, stem length and diameter for the cuttings themselves. While our statistical analysis is still in progress, I have a few preliminary results to share with you all today. And that includes our survival by soil type, comparing the native and the non-native species right here. We see a trend that where the native species here seems to have responded more favorably to the control soil than the allelopathic soil, somewhat to be expected. However, I do want to point out that based on our chi-square p-values, this data is rather insignificant. So take that as you will, of course. With our invasive species here, we also do see that mortality was actually decreased with the allelopathic soil, again, pointing out that insignificant p-value. So then moving into the watering treatment, when we compare the native and invasive species, again, across the board, the mortality is over 80%, so that's not great. We might discuss what that trend might say moving forward in a minute, but it does seem to be that the native and invasive species do tend to do better under average precipitation rather than the high or low value, again, indicating to or pointing towards the p-value to show that this data was found to be statistically insignificant, while it is a trend. So what does this mean? With the high mortality rate and the insignificant p-values, we can't exactly apply this broad spectrum, of course, but it is important. But this could be something to look into the implications of some of these trends that were observed. So both the native and exotic willow do poorly with the variable precipitation, and with climate change, variable precipitation is going to continue to increase, and that kind of means like what should we do about that? With this would potentially indicate that we would want to look to new species, potentially more herbaceous species. But again, I do want to say this is only the survival data. There is more data to come, and potentially that would provide us with more insight into this. And so moving forward, we're going to hopefully continue to look into how native and invasive species will compete native and invasive species in the same genotype will compete in stress conditions, and continue to look at the interplay between allelopathy and variable precipitation as this becomes increasingly more prescient. And I do want to just briefly add that allelopathy and soil type and texture need further study, because there were a couple of studies that indicated that the interplay between those might cause pretty significant changes to the results of such studies. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Thank you so much. Thank you to my advisors, and thank you for the conference.
Thank you so much, Mar. We're running a little bit behind, but there are a few questions in the chat. If you want to address them through typing, that'd be great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving on to our final talk of the session, and this will be from Amanda Suzzi, a postdoctoral fellow at the Pennsylvania State University and member of the Northeast RISC leadership team, who will be presenting Scanning the Horizon, Identifying Climate-Driven Range-Shifting Forest Pests in the Northeastern USA. Looks great, Amanda. You are muted, though, at the moment.
Thank you for the reminder. I was talking to a muted computer. It's like I'm new at this, except I'm not. As Matt said, I'm here to talk about horizon scanning for range-shifting forest pests in a changing climate. And while I'm the one presenting this information, this is a greater collaboration at the Northeast RISC, led by Deah Lieurance at Penn State. So to introduce you a little bit, as you probably have heard several times over the past 2 days, the climate is changing. It's significantly reshaping ecosystems, as well as leading to range shifts in invasive species. Specifically, the Northeast forests are at risk as warming temperatures create favorable conditions for Southeast or Southern pests, specifically at a rate of about 35 kilometers per year moving north. As you can see in this graphic that I stole from a different RISC presentation, the climate in Massachusetts is predicted to be anywhere as far south as similar to Georgia by 2070. So to proactively address this, we adapted a horizon scanning technique to identify high-risk species before they become widespread. This horizon scanning approach looks something like this. We created a climate change rapid risk assessment tool modified from Roy et al. 2014 to assess climate-driven shifts in invasive forest pests. You'll notice here there are 4 metrics in the climate change rapid risk assessment tool. The first one is likelihood of range expansion, which determines how close a species is to the region and whether climate conditions will support its future arrival. For example, if the species is already in a neighboring state with a high climate match, it's ranked as very likely to arrive, or 5. These are all 1 through 5. The next one is likelihood of spread within the expanded range. That's when we assess how easily the species can move once it arrives. That includes natural dispersal like wind, water, animals, as well as human facilitated spread like trade or transportation. For example, a highly reproductive species with multiple dispersal pathways would be ranked a 5 or very likely to spread. Third one here is the magnitude of impact. We evaluate how much ecological, economic, or social damage the species could cause based on damage it's caused in the other areas, which could include effects on native biodiversity, forest structure, economic loss in forestry, or human health concerns. For example, a pest that disrupts forest succession and damages timber industries might be ranked as high impact, or 5. And we initially included management feasibility. And we wanted to determine if current management strategies can control the species. But most of the species lacked information, so we didn't include management feasibility in the scores. However, if you were to adapt this to another group of species, you might want to look at management feasibility. Part of that first one, the likelihood of range expansion, included climate matching tools to predict species range shifts and if they would have future suitability under a future climate scenario. So here you see those 3 metrics we ended up with: the likelihood of range expansion, the likelihood of establishment spread, and the magnitude of impact. Each of these were scored from 1 to 5. When you multiply those together, you come up with a range from 1, if they're all scored 1, to 100. 5 times 5 times 5, 125, what could be the highest score. Nobody ranked 125, coincidentally. So if you do 4 times 4 times 4, which is not the highest score you could get, you would be ranked greater than a 64 score, which is a high risk level. We had 8 species that were this high risk level. We'll go over those on the next slide. If your total was between 27 and 64, your risk level was moderate, and we had 18 of those species. If your score was less than 27, which is 3 times 3 times 3, your risk level was low, and we had 54 of those species. Now I mentioned those 8 high species. Here they are. Notice that the certainty was high or moderate for all of these high-risk species. That meant there was a lot of information available when we did a literature review. Most of the low or the data deficient species were low risk. So there was a little bit of a correlation between risk value and how much information was out there. Also notice the primary path of arrival of all of these high risk species is either transport stowaway or transport contaminant. That means they're moving on things that we're moving. So that's why don't move the firewood is really important. I heard that a couple of talks ago. So you can see how none of them scored 5 in all 3 categories, which is a little interesting. So the top score was 100. And there is variability in where they scored what. Now, I haven't provided you with the rubric, so you don't know how we came up with these scores. But let's go over 3 of these 3 right here, so you get an idea. The rubric will be published when we publish the research. So for example, this subterranean termite, the likelihood of range expansion was 4 because it had a moderate future climate match, and it's established in secondary neighboring states. Those are neighbors of our Northeast states. Its likelihood of establishment or spread is a 5 because it has a really high reproductive potential and it's more aggressive than native termites. Its impact is a 5 because it has significant economic consequences, as well as it can easily outcompete native termites. Heavy infestations can cause local extinctions of certain tree species. So the 4 times 5 times 5 is 100 for a score. Similarly scored is the black timber bark beetle. This might actually already be in the region, but there are not any, or at least not enough, records in GBIF. However, there are records in EDMAPS. So the likelihood of range expansion here is 5 because we think it is here, but in low numbers. It also has a medium to high climate match. The likelihood of spread is 5 because the females can disperse by flight over relatively long distances and by human transport of infested wood. The impacts, however, this time are only a 4 because it only occasionally attacks healthy trees. It mostly attacks stressed, dying, or recently killed trees. However, its host species, host trees, have a large range, and it includes several dominant tree species in the Northeast. And our last example here is the Western tent caterpillar. This has a high likelihood of expansion because it's already present in Massachusetts and New York, but in small numbers. A low likelihood of establishment because it spreads via the timber trade, but there's minimal information on the spread. And impact score of 4 because it causes reduced tree growth, fruit production, and death in aspen, red alder, and other host trees. We have seen some species replacement in the West. So, and this one had a medium confidence level, mostly because there's not a lot of information on spread. My experience with this risk assessment was that forest pests are not widely studied and definitely not identified by citizen scientists when they're out there using the iNaturalist apps that they do. Some of the management implications of this is that proactive monitoring is critical. Detecting species before they establish is far more effective than reactive management. We know this from the evasion curve. However, using climate change models while horizon scanning will strengthen the early detection and rapid response strategy. So we should be incorporating more climate risk models into management plans. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people working on this project. It's been a collaborative effort between all of the researchers named here, many of whom are on this call. And if you're interested in collaborating or learning more, please reach out to Deah. And if Deah, if you want to throw your email in the chat, would be helpful.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. Due to time, we're just going to ask that you answer the questions in the chat separately, but we're going to move on to wrapping up the symposium now. Just going to spotlight Tony Lynn real quick. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Tony Lynn to close us out, and thank you all for coming to our last session.
Super. Hi, everybody. It's grateful to have the opportunity to wrap up here. Just a little reminder of the whirlwind that we went through together. We started out the meeting yesterday with a plenary from Catherine Jarnovich on the web tool Inhabit and the information it provides on habitat suitability to support important management tools such as species watch lists. We then had speakers on co-production as well as contributed presentations. This was a new addition for the symposium this year and added, I think, a wonderful diversity and new fresh perspectives. Starting out today, Dr. Deah Lieurance pinch hit for us and presented on introductory pathways. Emma van der Heide presented on analyzing whether treatments are effective or wasted effort with an example of invasive thistles, which then later we had a big conversation in the chat about. Then we had 2 aquatic species talks. Justin Hubbard told us about aquatic species in trade under current and future conditions, and Hyunwoo Lee presented his work on game theoretical models. We had after lunch a fantastic panel where Fusco, Emilie Inoue, and Rachel Reeb gave us a lot to think about in terms of terminology and communication. And finally, we had just finished up another section of contributed talks where Grace Gutierrez talked about reviewing seed collection strategies for climate smart restoration. High schooler Shriya Natarajan taught us about the EradicateIt app. Wiltz, an undergraduate, spoke to us about their research on the interaction of climate change and knotweed. And finally, Amanda Suzzi just closed us out talking about the Horizon Scanning Project. This year's recipient was of our Community Action Award was the Jackson Audubon Society, celebrating their work at the Hanalea Sanctuary from my home, Michigan, that has transformed a former agricultural area into a widely respected bird sanctuary. Please send in nominations, even today, while you're thinking of it, for next year, so we could highlight you or your organization. And finally, I guess I just wanted to close out. I'm feeling a lot of emotions lately, as I'm sure a lot of you are as well. And being with this community makes me think back. We've been doing this work for about 9 years when myself, I think I might have forgotten to say who I am. I'm Tony Lynn Morelli, and today I work for the U.S. Geological Survey at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Carrie Brown Lima on the right here, who started the RISC, the whole RISC, which started here in the Northeast, and myself and Bethany Bradley, we all also work at the Northeast CASC, and Carrie and I are federal employees. And it's a pretty hard time right now in terms of being connected and feeling empowered by your job as a federal employee. And being here in this group, to know that in 10 years, we've gone from the 3 of us and a dream to this amazing community of almost 1,000 people. All of you that showed up for these last 2 days, all of the work that we do. This is our year in review, and I know you can't really see it, but you can find it on our website, but you can see how many of us there are and how much we produce in all the work we do. And we do it together because it matters. So thank you for being here. And you can keep connecting with us. Please keep connecting with us. Tell us how we can improve, how we can help more, how we can do more, because we'll still be here. We are committed. So thank you for everyone. Thank you to the RISC team who did all the great work here the last couple of days and the last several months to have this amazing meeting go off without a hitch. And we will see you at the next one, but of course sooner on email and LinkedIn, and send us your comments. Thanks, everybody.